What's everyone, how are you all? Today we are back with another blazing Naruto story. What if Naruto's jutsu summoned real women? Who wanted him forever? If you enjoy, then please like, share and do comments. And also check the description to original creator of this beautiful creation. It had long been known among the Hokage's guards that Uzumaki Naruto suffered from nightmares and that rushing into the office every time he cried out in terror would only wear you out and earn you a frightening glare. One that was even worse than the glare they received if they accidentally called him Hokage-sama. Most ninja had nightmares at some point. It was impossible to see and do the things that they were occasionally required to do without being affected in some way, but Naruto's seemed more persistent than was usual. Konohamaru, when he thought Naruto was out of earshot, had theorized that the loss of so many friends had a more powerful effect on Naruto because he had gone so long without them as a child. He and others had heard Naruto proclaim that he would protect his precious people often enough to know how important it was to the village leader, and it seemed clear to him that when Naruto inevitably hadn't been able to protect everyone, it had wounded him in a place that wouldn't heal quickly, if ever. Naruto had overheard those comments and had informed Konohamaru that if he had time to discuss another person's dreams, which were not really as bad as everyone tried to claim, perhaps he should be given a few extra missions. It was on one of those extra missions that Konohamaru and his team had been ambushed in. Naruto's brilliant blue eyes snapped open and then instantly shut again as he moaned in protest over the brightness of the room and the immense headache that erupted the moment he became fully aware of what was going on around him. "Damn Sakaba," the blonde groaned. "He knows he's supposed to cut me off before I get too drunk." His voice sounded strange in his ears, more high-pitched than he was used to, but he brushed it off as the lingering influences of the sake and tried to sit up. For some reason he'd put more strength into the movement than he'd intended and ended up nearly smashing his face into his knees. How much did that bastard let me drink last night? He wondered as he slowly opened his eyes once more and tried to acclimate them to the light. As the blurry shapes around him slowly came into focus, his eyes widened in alarm, and then promptly snapped shut against the pain from the light. Where the hell was he? If he'd ended up in some barmaid's room, he was going to be really pissed, which was funny, when he thought about it, because getting pissed was probably what got him into this position in the first place. If Jiraiya were still alive, he'd be laughing his ass off at his poor student. Of course, that would be preferable to what Sakura would have done to him if she wasn't. Naruto ruthlessly squashed that train of thought and opened his eyes again. He had more important things to think about than the ghosts of the past. With another groan he reached up to brush his long blonde hair back, but instead punched himself in the eye. "Damn it," he grumbled as the blow seemed to double the headache he was already suffering through. With his hand on his face, it was easy just to slide it up to his hair, but what he found there shocked him even more than his lack of coordination. Normally his hair hung down around his shoulders, its natural spikiness remaining but losing the battle against gravity. As he'd started letting it grow, Sakura had commented that he looked good with longer hair, and so he'd kept it even when it started to annoy him. This morning, however, it was short again, very short. He probably hadn't had hair this length since before he'd gone off to train with Jiraiya. What sort of sick bastard cuts a man's hair while he's sleeping? Naruto wondered, and then an even more troubling thought struck him. What sort of confident, sick bastard cuts the most powerful ninja in the village's hair while he's sleeping? Naruto could count the number of people who could get away with something like this on one finger, and she'd never do anything like that even if she thought he was letting it get a little too long. Hinata just wasn't that sort of person. Kiba might have done it before he'd. Well, back then Kiba wasn't exactly one to talk about keeping one's hair trimmed anyway. With a sigh, Naruto waved his hand through the air as if warding off the spirits of the dead and then looked around the sparsely decorated room. It didn't look like the sort of room a barmaid would keep, but perhaps he was seriously overestimating her. The bland, whitish-colored paint was chipped and peeling off the wall, though it looked like someone had attempted to cover up the worst of it with either glue or tape. Of course, taping paint to a wall didn't really seem to help too much, but he couldn't deny that an effort had been made to make the place look almost nice. A wasted effort, but an effort nonetheless. There was a small, half-dead plant that was either recovering from near death or heading towards it and had probably been pulled out of a dumpster at some point given the condition of the pot it was resting in. A few ramen posters decorated the walls along with little scrolls upon which random slogans were drawn in sloppy, almost illegible, kanji, no doubt covering up more peeling paint. Naruto had had a few such ramen posters on his own walls as a child and knew that they were free if you sent in enough proofs of purchase to different ramen companies, which meant that whoever had brought him here at least had good taste, and maybe even some extra ramen they'd be willing to part with. He sighed at the nostalgic thought of ramen. It had been so long since he'd last enjoyed a nice steaming bowl of his favorite food. As his mouth watered with the memory, his eyes shifted to the window and his heart nearly stopped. Where was he? The view from the window was of a peaceful village in the middle of a normal day. It looked sort of the way Konoha once had, years and years ago. Actually, Naruto thought as he leaned towards the window and stared in awe at the world outside, it looks a lot like Konoha used to. He watched for a moment longer and then turned his attention back to the room, his eyes suddenly alert and the pain from his headache pushed into the back of his mind. Something was wrong. This room felt extremely familiar, but at the same time felt misplaced, as if he wasn't supposed to be there. At that moment he heard a door open in an adjoining room and the sounds of footsteps entering. In an instant he had thrown the sheets covering him aside and was reaching for a weapon as he jumped out of bed. Or at least tried to. Instead, he ended up falling flat on his face when his feet didn't hit the ground when they were supposed to. Crap, he grumbled as he rolled onto his back and tried to rub his nose only to hit himself in the mouth as he once again failed to properly move his limbs. It was quickly becoming apparent that he'd been drugged or had some sort of nerve damage that Kyuubi's healing powers weren't feeling up to fixing. Had he been attacked by some enemy the previous night when he was staggering home after leaving the bar? Had he been kidnapped somehow? Those ideas seemed incredibly unlikely. The village council had assigned Anbu members to watch over him when he left the Hokage Tower, despite his objections to the precautions, and even drunk he would have been more than a match for the majority of people who'd like to kill him. He was the strongest person in the village, and officially the Hokage, the leader of the village no matter how much the council hated to admit it, and arguably stronger than any other official Hokage that had come before him. Why did he need guards? The council, however, had insisted, pointing out that he could be removed from his position, which Naruto highly doubted, if he refused to cooperate with those charged with running the village, namely, them. It was moments like those where he truly understood why Tsunade Ban had been so reluctant to take the name Hokage and why Jiraiya had outright refused it, and those two hadn't even had to deal with a council full of people that still hated them for something sealed in their bodies when they were babies. Hinata chided him when he said it out loud, but he longed for the day when the older generation finally died out so his few surviving peers, who accepted him for who he was, could take over the council positions. He strained his ears and remained perfectly still on the floor, listening for any sound that would tell him if his captors had heard him, but their faint conversation continued without pause. With a grunt of unexpected exertion, Naruto sat up and slowly climbed to his feet, still wondering why his body felt so strange. Sai and Shikamaru would probably have told him that he'd be better off staying in bed and letting whoever was out there come to him. Actually, Sai would have asked something stupid like whether or not Naruto still had balls, and Shikamaru would have rolled his eyes and muttered, "Troublesome," if they were still around, but they hadn't been for a long time, so Naruto was free to do whatever he wanted without being criticized for it. If the voices belonged to enemies, they weren't going to stay out there forever without checking up on him, and if they were friends it would be better to meet them standing up than lying on the floor. He'd never had a lot of patience and he hated looking weak in front of others, so he was going to go and see what was going on and either kick someone's ass for cutting his hair or kick someone's ass for kidnapping him and cutting his hair. As he pulled himself up to his full height, he again felt like something was off. The whole room seemed to be set up as an optical illusion because he felt shorter than he knew he was when he looked around. Either that or the room had been made for a very tall person with everything proportioned for his added height. Doing something like that seemed a pointless waste of energy to Naruto, since it was just as easy to duck one's head, but who was he to criticize the eccentricities of others? He carefully shuffled his feet across the floor, heading towards the door and hoping to avoid another fall until his body began acting normal again. When he reached the doorway, he grabbed the handle that was at mid-chest level when it felt like it should have been closer to his waist, but as he started to turn it, the voices on the other side began to speak again, and this time he could actually make out what they were saying. "So, this is Naruto's house, huh?" a lazy, slightly muffled voice asked. Naruto's breath caught in his throat, causing him to cough as he swallowed badly. He knew that voice, and it wasn't supposed to be a voice that was around anymore. Kakashi had been dead for almost a decade. The blonde ninja's jaw flexed as he squashed the emotions trying to rise up within him. It was probably just his ears playing tricks on him. The voices were coming through a door and possibly through masks as well. There was no reason to imitate Kakashi since Naruto knew without a shadow of a doubt that his former mentor was dead. He'd been the one who killed him, after all. He's a moron, but I think giving him to you is best. You have a good nose for these types. The second voice seemed familiar as well, but Naruto couldn't think of where he'd heard it before, if he ever had. Regardless, these two were underestimating him, thinking he could just be handed over to someone like it was nothing. They were about to see that even with his body drugged or injured Uzumaki, Naruto was no one to be trifled with. Plus you. Naruto turned the handle and pushed the door open, his muscles already tensing as they prepared to launch him either at his attackers or behind some cover if anything was thrown at him. Alright you bastards, just WH. His voice died on his lips as he caught sight of the bastards, who were both staring at him as if he were the strangest thing they'd ever seen. One was older, with wizened features and a gray goatee. A finely carved wooden pipe that he had probably been smoking was hanging precariously from his opened mouth, a thin trail of smoke still rising from it. Most importantly, he was dressed in the white and red robes and hat of the Hokage of Konohagakure. The other was a tall, slender man wearing a green Chunin vest, a dark blue mask covering his face, and a hite over one eye while his silvery hair stood almost straight up in defiance of gravity. Naruto knew that the man's one visible eye was normally only half open, as though it was too much work to open it the rest of the way. At the moment, however, it was nearly 3/4 of the way open in his mild surprise. They looked exactly like two men that Naruto held in supreme regard. Two men who had helped shape the man Naruto had become, two men who were most definitely dead. Naruto's butt hit the ground hard as his legs gave out and his breath caught in his throat. What is this? Naruto? The man who looked like the third asked in the gruff, gravely voice that the elderly occasionally gained as they aged. He rescued his pipe just as it started to fall from his mouth and then asked, "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be. What the hell is going on?" Naruto yelled louder as his feet pushed against the worn wooden floor, sliding him back into the room he'd come from until his back hit the bed, and even then his feet kept moving in an attempt to put as much distance between himself and the ghosts as possible, even if it meant driving him through solid objects. "Naruto, what's wrong?" the old man asked, his gray eyes now filled with concern. The man who looked like Kakashi had stopped watching Naruto and instead began wandering the small kitchen space, even taking a peek inside a refrigerator that looked like it had seen better days, and not any time recently either. Naruto could only stare up at the old man's face in wonder. He'd never seen such a perfect reproduction of another person without anything to base it on. Whoever these guys were, they were good. They even had the two liver spots on the third's left cheek in the right places. Naruto knew every detail of the third's old, wrinkled face. He'd spent countless hours staring up at it while sitting at his desk pretending to do paperwork, and the face he was looking at right now was so flawless it had to be a jutsu of some sort. "Is this a genjutsu?" Naruto asked in a voice that he hoped sounded more confident than he felt. "Genjutsu?" the old man laughed. "Naruto, you aren't making any sense. You're supposed to be in class right now getting your team assignments. What are you doing sleeping in so late on today of all days?" Naruto scowled and brought two fingers up in front of his chest as his other hand closed around them. "Yeah right," he hissed, "and I suppose I'm just some little genin who should go hurrying off to the academy so Iruka-sensei doesn't get mad at me, right?" He felt his considerably large chakra reserves well up within him on command and pushed it out as he called out, "Release." The man pretending to be the third's eyebrows rose until they vanished under his hat as the wisps of smoke curling out of his pipe drifted away from the blonde with the expulsion of energy and were momentarily trapped under the Hokage's hat. "Naruto," he growled, his voice suddenly very serious, "get a hold of yourself. You aren't in a genjutsu and you are a genin who better hurry up and get to class before Iruka gets mad at you. After what the two of you went through the other day, I'd have thought you'd be a little more considerate towards his feelings." Naruto wasn't listening. He was still too caught up in the surprise that he hadn't been able to break free of the genjutsu. It was possible, he supposed, that he wasn't stuck in a jutsu, but instead that these two men were playing some other sort of trick on him. somehow disguising themselves as the third and Kakashi, or maybe the genjutsu user was just extremely good. What do you want with me? Naruto demanded at last, swallowing the confusion that he'd felt when he'd first set eyes upon them. Konoha won't negotiate with you and they won't pay any sort of ransom, even if you. Shut up, Naruto, the old man groaned as he rubbed his forehead with his hand, momentarily pushing back his hat and revealing another perfectly placed liver spot that was not always visible. I know you're not the third, so you can stop pretending, Naruto shot back. The third's been dead for years. If you wanted to try something like this you should have disguised yourself as Tease. Naruto was unable to finish his last line as the old man burst into laughter. Dead, you say? He chuckled merrily. My boy, 69 might seem old to one so young, but it's not that old. I've still got a few more years left in me, I think. Excuse me, Kakashi's voice asked as his head peeked through the doorway into the bedroom. Have you been drinking this? He held up a milk carton with a picture of a black and white cow on it and gave it a little shake. Liquid could be heard sloshing back and forth within along with the sounds of more solid pieces hitting the cardboard walls. Naruto stared at the image of his old sensei in confusion while the pretend Hokage nodded his head in understanding. Naruto, you had a bad dream last night, that's all, the old man said with a kind smile. When you put that sort of thing in your body right before you go to sleep, it's bound to give you unsettling dreams. Or the runs, Kakashi added offhandedly as he headed back to the kitchen to return the expired milk to the refrigerator. It wasn't a dream, Naruto insisted. I'm the Hokage, well, the temporary Hokage anyway, and you were dead. Naruto, there's no such thing as a temporary Hokage, the old man pointed out. You're either Hokage or you aren't. But, I know it seemed real to you and it probably didn't help that you woke up to strange voices in your home, but it was only a dream. Now go get dressed and Kakashi-sensei here will take you to meet your teammates. Naruto looked from the face of the third to Kakashi and then back again, trying to think of something to say, but instead found himself rising to his feet and nodding. The third smiled at him and stepped out of the room, quietly closing the door behind him. Through the door Naruto heard him say, not quite the way I expected you to meet him, but that's Naruto for you. Kakashi's response was unintelligible, but it was just as well. Naruto had other things to worry about, like trying to figure out what the hell was going on and who those two men were, because they weren't Sarutobi Hiruzen and Hitaki Kakashi, he was sure of that much, at least. Naruto sat down on the bed and looked around. Now that he sort of knew what game was going on, he had to admit that the room did look a lot like the bedroom of his old apartment. The posters were right, the half-dead plant was about where he remembered Mr. Yuki being until he'd nursed it back to health and given it to Kakashi to add a little color to his sensei's apartment, and the view from the window was good enough that Naruto couldn't see any differences. After deciding that there weren't going to be any mistakes that he could spot just by looking hard enough, he stumbled over to a beat-up dresser that was even missing the front right corner like his head following a mishap dragging it up to the apartment from the dumpster in a back alley not too far from where he had lived. Inside he found a single orange jacket with a white collar and blue panels on the shoulders and upper chest, 2 pairs of orange pants, and 4 dark blue shirts. They were exactly what he'd worn when he was younger. They wouldn't fit now, of course, but he had to be impressed by the level of detail this genjutsu or masquerade was showing. Whoever was behind this had gotten the third down perfectly and had almost gotten Kakashi right as well, except that they'd made him much too tall. They had his room right and also his clothing, but while they could reproduce a room or two and maybe a few people, they couldn't change the fact that Naruto had grown over 30 centimeters and gained about 25 kilograms in the 15+ years that separated him from his 12-year-old self. The jacket and pants wouldn't fit him now. Naruto slowly reached down and touched the clothing, smiling at the wave of nostalgia that overtook him as he felt the worn cloth under his fingertips. And then, slowly his smile dropped to a frown as he stared at his hand. It looked strange for some reason. It was small and smooth, like the hand of a child. He flexed his fingers experimentally, squeezing the jacket under them, just to make sure they were really his, and then hurried towards the bathroom, stumbling and falling into the wall twice before finally arriving. As with everything else, his bathroom had been reproduced well enough that he couldn't see any mistakes. The mirror was cracked and one of the handles on the faucet was missing. The rusted drain in the sink didn't have a stopper anymore, though there clearly was supposed to be one. His old toothbrush. or at least what looked like his old toothbrush, was sitting on the edge of the sink as if it had been hurriedly thrown down while he ran off to class, and the tube of toothpaste was missing its lid, leaving a crusty mess around the opening. Naruto's gaze, however, was fixed on the mirror, or, more accurately, on the face staring out of the mirror. It was him as he'd been years and years ago. The image wasn't of an adult or even of himself after he'd trained with Jiraiya, it was that of a child. The boy in the mirror's eyes widened in terror as he stared at Naruto, and his hand slowly reached up and touched his face just as Naruto's did the same. Naruto nearly cried out in alarm, but quickly bit down on his tongue before he could make a sound. The last thing he needed now was to have the old man pretending to be the third come rushing in to make fun of him some more. He couldn't lose his head over this, he had to think and figure out what was going on. He was in a genjutsu, he was sure of it now. No amount of makeup or costumes could produce this sort of effect, and any henge placed on him would have been dispelled when he'd tried to release the genjutsu earlier. Was this Jigyaku no Jutsu, then? Or maybe some other genjutsu he'd never heard of before? Jigyaku was used to retrieve memories in greater detail than the conscious mind could normally produce, and it didn't seem likely that it was what Naruto was under. He'd never used it himself, but he'd be under the hypnosis technique once or twice, and it hadn't felt like this. Those times he'd recounted a few difficult-to-recall memories with perfect clarity, not made up something completely new. He'd also been aware of the fact that he was speaking and telling those around him what he was seeing in his mind. That wasn't happening here. Naruto slowly sank to the floor, ran his fingers through his short, spiky, blonde hair, and blew out a calming breath, but didn't feel much calmer for it. He closed his eyes and drew in another deep breath as he tried to think. Something must have happened to him the previous night. Had he actually gone out drinking like he'd originally thought, or had something else happened? It took him a moment, but then he remembered that Hinata had come by the day before delivering a message from her husband, the leader of the Hyuga clan, requesting a meeting last night, and Naruto had been forced to accept. Much as he hated to admit it, he needed the damn Hyuga clan in general and their leader in particular to remain happy in order to fight the enemy outside the gates without worrying about the ones inside. The leader of the clan, Hyuga Hiroshi, Hinata's husband, though Naruto hated to think of the man as such, was politically savvy and always looking to scoot up a few notches on the totem pole of power, usually by knocking someone else down a few pegs. Had Hiroshi done this to him somehow? Naruto didn't think it was likely. He knew the man disliked him, and the feeling was more than reciprocated on Naruto's side, but Hiroshi was a coward who would never do something like this. He might hit and belittle his wife, who was willing to put up with the abuse for the good of her clan, even when Naruto told her nothing good was coming from what was happening to her, but he wouldn't attack the de facto leader of the village no matter how much he might like to. No, he would try to whittle away at Naruto's support amongst the village council, as if he really had any to begin with, and look forward to the day when the war with the sound ended and he could politically stab Naruto in the back. Hiroshi wasn't stupid, nor was he particularly brave in real combat unless someone was watching. Something like this was beyond him. Naruto frowned thoughtfully. Had he even met with the bastard the previous night? No, something else had happened. A battle? Yes, that was it. Naruto had fought someone, while Konoha was burning around him. He gasped as the memory of the pinwheel pupil and Tomo of Orochimaru's Mangekyo Sharingan flashed in front of his eyes. So that's it, huh? This isn't Jigyaku no Jutsu, it is Tsukuyomi, Naruto thought dejectedly. He'd only gone through both Madara's and Itachi's Tsukuyomi once or twice each, but that was more than plenty as far as he was concerned, and also more than most anyone else had lived through to his knowledge. The genjutsu created by the Mangekyo Sharingan was arguably the most powerful in the world. Once you saw that Sharingan, you were trapped in the jutsu until either the user ran out of chakra or got bored of torturing you. Unfortunately, days could seem to pass inside the technique while only a few seconds of real time slipped by, so running out of chakra wasn't much of a problem, and Orochimaru enjoyed torturing people far too much to get bored of it anytime soon. This was far different from what he'd seen the last time he was trapped. At that time, Madara had made it seem that Naruto was being mauled by something that looked like Kyuubi over and over for a week, the sequence always starting over just as he felt himself about to die. The sky and moon had been red then, and the world around him had been strangely colored as well, whereas here he was seeing things that looked completely and totally natural. Other times things had appeared to be normal, But usually something horrible happened that quickly clued him into the fact that things were not normal, like his skin melting or turning into Sasuke with his curse seal activated. But so far, other than appearing to be younger and meeting up with two people who were definitely dead, nothing too strange was happening to him. He certainly wasn't being attacked at all. Were it not for the fact that he could remember being older, this illusion would have seemed completely real and he might have just gotten dressed and headed off to the academy to get his team assignments. Had Orochimaru really advanced this much already? Were even his Uchiha techniques so far beyond Itachi's and Madara's as to make the previous two strongest living Uchihas look like children who were only pretending to be a ninja? Naruto shook his head and opened his blue eyes, staring unseeingly up at a crack on the ceiling. If Orochimaru was that powerful, there was no way anyone would stand a chance against him. Konoha would be destroyed, or perhaps, more destroyed, was a more accurate way of putting it. The only thing he could do when he awoke from this would be to either fight Orochimaru in an attempt to give any surviving ninja and villagers a chance to flee or to simply unseal the Kyuubi and accept the consequences that would come with that. Kyuubi could possibly kill Orochimaru, but he'd probably kill everyone else as well. Either way, they were all dead. At least Kyuubi would kill them quickly and might not hunt every last one of them down and slaughter them. If he knew Anko's Sojususai no Jutsu, he could try to use that. Though the Sharingan would probably see what he was trying to do the moment he started to make his move. But it didn't matter because Orochimaru and Anko were the only two who knew the suicide technique from what Naruto had heard. Anko had taken its secret to her grave and Orochimaru was possibly even less likely to tell him how to do it than she was. With a nearly overwhelming sense of hopelessness, Naruto rose to his feet, stumbled over to the dresser, and got dressed as quickly as possible. He smiled weakly down at what looked like the Hite 8 Iruka had given him when he first graduated and then tied it around his head, using it to hold his bangs away from his eyes. The torture would no doubt start soon and he planned on taking it like a true leaf nin and then when it was over he was going to unleash hell on his enemy, and everyone else. With one last sigh, Naruto worked his way over to the door, still struggling to control his body, and went out to see the imaginary ghosts that had probably been sent to begin his torture. Hitaki Kakashi did not like children on a normal basis and as they made their way through the winding dirt streets of Konoha, he was growing ever more certain that, despite the boy's parentage, he was especially going to dislike Uzumaki Naruto. He wasn't normally the sort to jump to conclusions so quickly, but in this case he couldn't deny what his gut was telling him. The boy had started out interesting enough, skipping his last class of the year, missing team assignments, and then practically attacking the Hokage of all people was enough to get Kakashi to pay some attention to him, but it had really been all downhill from there. After they had left Naruto's apartment, they had hit the main street which would lead them almost straight to the academy. Naruto had followed quietly behind him, except when he would inexplicably stumble or trip over his own feet. The Hokage had said the boy was a bit of a moron, but Kakashi wasn't sure how Naruto had managed to live 12 whole years without learning how to put one foot in front of the other properly. It was as if he was trying to take larger steps than his legs were capable of and his arms were swinging awkwardly at his sides. The first few people they passed had started to smile as they saw them, or more accurately, they had smiled at Kakashi. Then Naruto had tripped or fallen and alerted them to his presence, at which point their eyes had become cold and their smiles had fallen. The first time this had happened Naruto had looked shocked and more than a little hurt, as if he were expecting a totally different reaction, but then he'd schooled his face, firmly placed his eyes straight ahead, and then promptly tripped and fell on his face. This, naturally, but not necessarily fairly, had earned him some cruel laughter from those around him as he tried to pick himself off the ground. After a while Kakashi had decided to take a side route to save Naruto from any more taunts and also to see what his reaction would be. He couldn't officially consider it a test, but he was curious as to how Naruto, who was almost legendary for his disregard for any and all authority, would react. Kakashi disliked people who followed their leaders regardless of how idiotic their decisions were, the sort of person he'd been when he was Naruto's age, and figured that Naruto probably stood a better chance of restoring his faith in fresh from the academy genin than anyone else on his team. Sadly, Naruto had looked confused, but then shrugged and followed at his potential instructor's feet like an obedient little puppy. If he were allowed to, Kakashi might have failed him right then. He almost considered asking why Naruto didn't bother to point out that they were taking the long route, but before he could, Naruto tripped and ended up head down in a trash can that he'd unsuccessfully attempted to sidestep, his feet kicking back and forth in a desperate and futile attempt to free himself. Kakashi grabbed the blonde ninja by his ankle and lifted him straight out of the refuse, wrinkling his nose under his mask at the stench that came with the boy. Part of Naruto's face was now covered in some sort of green muck that had probably been there for longer than it should have, and a banana peel had managed to get stuck on his hite. The white collar of his orange jacket as well as half of his head were soaked in an unidentifiable yellow liquid, and the moment he was dropped unceremoniously on the ground he fished something out of one of his sleeve and tossed it back at the trash can, missing horribly. Kakashi glanced down at the object and rolled his eyes. It was a large, overflowing diaper. That was uncalled for, Naruto grumbled as he spit some of the green, smelly slime from his mouth and looked up at the sky in annoyance. Kakashi thought about letting his young charge go home and change, but after Naruto's failure to even make a peep about the long cut they were currently taking, he decided to let the boys suffer for the moment. The meeting wouldn't be that long and a ninja needed to learn to deal with all sorts of hardships, not that Naruto or anyone on his team was likely to become a ninja anyway. "Come on, we don't want to be late," Kakashi said in a cheerful voice. "Yes, sensei, that's clearly something you're worried about," Naruto replied, earning himself a few points without even meaning to, though the way he said, "sensei," left something to be desired. Kakashi wanted people who would think for themselves, not someone who disrespected his leaders. "We'll take the roofs, that way you won't cause too much of a scene." "Whatever." Kakashi gave Naruto a slightly sour look and then leapt onto a nearby balcony before bouncing up onto the rooftops above them. Naruto tried to follow him, but overshot the balcony horribly, crashing through a window and into someone's apartment. A second later there was a loud scream and the sounds of a struggle, and then Naruto hurried back through the window, tripped, and fell back down to earth, landing on his back in a cloud of dust with a thud. Kakashi's head hit his hand as he stared down at the clumsy boy. "Why don't you just get there when you can?" he suggested. Naruto's response was not something that a 12-year-old should have ever heard, let alone be willing to repeat, and the hand gesture that accompanied it didn't help matters much. "Watch out for trash cans," the Junin offered helpfully before leaping away, quickly heading in the direction of the academy. "Ooh." Naruto scowled and closed his eyes, doing his best to ignore the stench that covered him and made his eyes sting and water. This was probably the most idiotic genjutsu he'd ever heard of, as well as the most detailed. He'd seen villagers along the road that he hadn't seen in years, but still recognized on sight. The baker who used to yell at him when he put his hands on the fresh baked bread and sniffed them lustfully, the old woman who spit in his direction almost every morning, the kids who were 4 or 5 years younger than him and had played silly games with him until their parents warned them to keep away from him. All of them were perfect. He'd never seen anything like it. It was as if he'd literally been transported back in time. He'd heard of and even been trapped in detailed jutsu before, but never anything at this level. Even though he was an evil, psychopathic, murdering bastard, Orochimaru really was amazing. Naruto suspected that at least part of the man's skills stemmed from Sasuke's own prodigious talents. If Sasuke had just stuck around and not betrayed the village, he would no doubt have eventually avenged his clan. But now he was nothing more than a tool for the snake Sanin, a container to be used up and then tossed aside when it was no longer useful. Naruto couldn't help but wonder if there was enough of Sasuke left in there to regret the fact that he would never resurrect his clan, the second part of his ambition. With a groan, Naruto rolled himself into a sitting position and stood up. He still couldn't control his body very well in this jutsu, and it was beginning to get annoying. He just wasn't used to being so short and weighing so little. When he'd mistimed his jump, it had been because he'd pushed too much chakra into his legs, and his numerous trips were due, at least in part, to him being used to longer legs. When he'd gone to step around the trash can, he'd assumed that one step would get him fully around it. Instead, it had left him only halfway there, and as he'd attempted to shift his body to avoid smashing into it, he'd again misjudged his size and had lost his balance. It seemed that Orochimaru was planning on using his Mangekyo Sharingan to embarrass Naruto to death. Not exactly what Naruto would have pictured the evil bastard who had practically taken over the entire world to do with one of the ultimate bloodline abilities, but then it was hard to understand the mind of someone like Orochimaru. It seemed out of character, but Naruto was looking at the evidence and he couldn't deny what was happening to him. He reached up and wiped more of the green slime away from his mouth, further staining his jacket, and then got to his feet and slowly made his way towards the academy, trying to carefully control his movements and also watching for the sneak attack that would probably be coming at any moment. Haruno Sakura shifted uncomfortably as the last of her classmates were led out the door by their Junin. Unconsciously she reached up and brushed a stray strand of pink hair away from her overly large, in her opinion, forehead and tucked it behind her ear as she glanced at the only other person in the room, Uchiha Sasuke. The silence in the room felt oppressive to her. It hadn't been too bad when the room had been filled with excited kids waiting for their Junin to show up. Even if some of them hated her for breaking the unspoken class time rules by daring to sit next to Sasuke and trying to talk with him earlier that day. But as they had gradually filed out of the room when their Junin called for them, a tension had settled in. She thought it might possibly only be her imagination since Sasuke didn't seem to notice, but she could feel the air thickening as the rest of their former classmates exited and left the two of them all alone. She glanced at him out of the corner of her eye again and sighed inwardly. He really was beautiful. Dark hair, dark eyes, flawless skin. He was perfect, or would be if he would talk a little so she didn't feel so uncomfortable. Should she say something to him? Try to break the ice? They were destined to fall in love with each other, after all, and loving relationships required communication. Heck, all relationships required communication. But what were they supposed to talk about? It had to be something safe, but also something interesting. Something that showed him how smart and funny she was, but it also had to inspire him to give a reply. A question, maybe? One that he'd feel like answering. So, what do you think is taking our sensei so long? She asked quickly and then instantly regretted it. It was not an interesting, funny, smart, or even slightly engaging question. Why had she asked it? Who knows? Sasuke said with a shrug without lifting his chin from his hands or taking his eyes off of the door. Sakura offered up a small prayer of thanks to the gods of love that he'd felt compelled to answer her lame question even as she asked a possibly lamer one. Do you think he's bringing Naruto? Sasuke shrugged his shoulders again and grunted. I hope he doesn't. She was growing desperate now and needed some sort of sustained conversation to quiet her nerves. I can't stand having Naruto around. He's just so annoying. Her lips twisted into a scowl as thoughts of past torments at the hands of her third teammate sprang to mind. His constant badgering of her to go on a date with him, the time he'd gotten her in trouble by passing a note to her, again asking if she'd go out with him. The way he always chased after her or tried to impress her with his perverted jokes and stupid pranks, embarrassing her in front of her friends, other villagers, and once even in front of her mother who had sternly told Sakura to stay away from him. As if she actually wanted him around. It's because he doesn't have any parents, she concluded aloud, barely even talking to Sasuke anymore. He just gets to do whatever he wants all the time and it's made him selfish and socially inept. She sighed and looked over at her crush who was glancing at her out of the corner of his eyes now, an unreadable expression on his face. Then she let her head fall back and stared up at the ceiling. If I did half the things he does, my parents would pull me out of the academy and ground me for life. Sometimes I envy him, not having parents to nag him all the time. It must be nice. Sakura smiled at the thought of being able to live on her own and turned towards Sasuke, expecting him to still be staring more or less straight ahead and ignoring her, but instead found his dark eyes boring into her. The expression on his face was enough to freeze her blood. You're an idiot, he hissed, his voice filled with contempt. Kids who grow up without parents always turn out selfish and lonely. You can't even imagine a pain that would compare with it. He shook his head angrily and then added, getting nagged by parents would be a dream come true to kids who grow up without them. Sakura's mouth fell open and she wished the wooden floor would open up and let her sink through it as she realized her blunder. She'd heard, of course, that Sasuke's family had been killed when he was younger and that he lived alone at the edge of the section of the village his clan had occupied. It had been part of his appeal, really. The brooding, handsome genius with the tragic past that he had to live with every day. It made the girls who were already attracted to him for his looks want to take him into their arms and heal his broken heart. The tragedy added a certain amount of mystery and danger to him. It was also something that most only thought about in an abstract sort of way. It never really occurred to them what the loss of his family meant to him, only what it would mean in some childish romantic fantasy. "Sasuke, just sit there and be quiet," he snapped, silencing her instantly and bringing tears to her green eyes. "I don't want to hear any more out of you. You're annoying." Sakura's eyes widened and then she nodded meekly before hanging her head, her pink hair hiding her tears as it hung down in front of her face. The rest of their weight was extremely uncomfortable, for Sakura especially, but it was also extremely quiet, which she hoped Sasuke would appreciate. Ooh. Kakashi had not gone to the academy as he'd told Naruto he would. Instead, he was following the boy from above, moving as silent as a shadow, completely hidden from view. While Naruto had been a disappointment so far, he was slowly becoming more interesting. He wasn't bouncing off the walls with excitement, trying to cause mischief, or anything else that Naruto was supposed to do. Instead, he was wandering through the back alleys of the village, which he seemed to know by heart, occasionally looking up at different and seemingly ordinary buildings in surprise and then quickly shaking his head and scowling as though he were having a mental argument with himself. He hadn't been tripping as much as he was earlier, but that seemed to be more due to the fact that he was practically dragging his feet through the dust of the streets and walkways than because he'd suddenly developed some coordination. There weren't very many people for him to run into on the side streets, but the ones he did come across all scowled and shouted at him from a distance and then plugged their noses as he drew nearer. Kakashi couldn't blame them for their second reaction. With his excellent sense of smell, he could easily detect the stench rolling off the boy, even from his hiding place on the rooftops. When they had been walking together down the main road, Naruto had recoiled in shock the first few times an insult had been hurled his way, but now he didn't even bother looking at those who cursed him. It was, Kakashi supposed, natural that Naruto would think his becoming a ninja would have changed the villagers' opinions of him. Many children thought that a new title meant they were new people. It usually didn't work that way, and it certainly wasn't going to in Naruto's case. He probably wouldn't even be a ninja for all that long anyway. Kakashi had never been great with children and he really didn't like them. He just couldn't understand what was going through their minds or why they always seemed so stupid when it came to the important stuff. His own childhood had been cut tragically short by when his father had shamed their family name and then killed himself, with Kakashi as a witness, leaving his young son to shoulder the burden of that shame on his own. On top of that, he grew up in the midst of the Third Great Ninja War, during which the death of a friend was almost an everyday occurrence. His prodigious talents helped him rise through the ranks quickly, basically making him an adult in the eyes of the village, and in his own eyes, for that matter, before he'd even hit puberty. Making him the babysitter of 3 very green genin was probably the worst idea anyone had ever had, but orders were orders. Besides, it wasn't like he'd ever actually had to lead a team of genin, because none of them could see through his test and earn the right to be called Leaf Ninja. He could, however, sympathize with what Naruto was going through. It wasn't all that long ago that he had been a person living with the consequences of something he hadn't done. The villagers had never said anything to him, but he had always been able to hear their whispers. He knew what they said about his father and what they wondered about him. It was hard to live in that sort of environment, watching his mother cry for the man that many in the village, including her own son, despised, but it would be harder for Naruto. He most likely would never be able to change the minds of the villagers, he would forever be an outcast. Were he a genius, as Kakashi was, then he might have had a chance, but with nothing to win them over with, Naruto would forever be associated only with the Kyuubi. As Naruto rounded a corner, Kakashi thought he saw the boy's blue eyes flash in his direction, but he neither slowed down nor sped up as he walked, so the Junin simply passed it off as coincidence. There was no way a genin who had barely managed to graduate could detect him. There probably wasn't even a way that a Chunin who had graduated first in his class would have noticed Kakashi. He continued to follow the boy all the way to the academy, moving casually but cautiously, mentally taking notes and drawing tentative conclusions about the boy who would be a part of his team for the next 26 hours or so. And silently wishing that the boy could have been a part of a team with a different Junin. It didn't seem fair that he would have to be the one to crush this particular boy's dreams, but orders were orders. Ooh. By the time Naruto and Kakashi reached the room where Sakura and Sasuke were waiting for them, Naruto was dirtier and more stinky than ever, having stumbled into 2 unpleasant messes that neither he nor Kakashi had wanted to identify, as well as more than a few trips into the dust of the streets and alleys. Sakura and Sasuke instantly wished that the two had taken longer to arrive, or that Naruto had opted not to arrive at all. Naruto, what is that smell? Sakura demanded the moment the blonde walked through the door. Were you rolling in manure? Naruto gave her a nasty look, which instantly softened as his eyes grew glassy. He quickly looked away and wiped a grime-covered hand across his face, leaving himself even messier, but with no hint of tears. It's not real, he whispered quietly, it's just an illusion. It doesn't smell like an illusion, Sakura scowled. You smelled terrible, why didn't you at least take a bath before you came? Naruto's jaw flexed and his eyes flashed for just a second and then he looked away, ignoring the rest of her comments, of which there were plenty, and refusing to even let his eyes accidentally land on Sasuke. Over and over he mouthed the words, not real, hoping to convince himself, but not entirely succeeding. The room was quiet for a moment and then Kakashi asked, you guys are on Team 7, right? As if any other Junin was going to be this late. What was that, Naruto? Kakashi asked, looking down at the dirty boy. Nothing, sensei, he replied in a voice filled with irritation and a healthy amount of disrespect. Naruto. Sakura hissed admonishingly, casting a slightly alarmed look at Kakashi, to whom she added, I'm so sorry about him, sensei. He's a rude idiot, just ignore him, everyone else does. Naruto snorted, but didn't offer a comeback. He could feel the muscles in his body constrict as he held back the desire to run over to her and throw his arms around her. It was hard to believe how easily the sight of her and the sound of her voice were affecting him. Sakura was dead, this wasn't her. All he was seeing and hearing was an illusion meant to drive him crazy, nothing more. Her scent filling his nostrils wasn't real, her voice wasn't real. None of it was anything more than an incredibly effective and detailed genjutsu. Why don't we go to the roof and get to know each other a bit? Kakashi suggested, his one eye focused on Sasuke, who had a calm, almost bored, expression on his face. Then I'll give you your instructions and you'll have the rest of the day to yourselves. The three genin followed him out of the room and up a flight of stairs, Sasuke and Sakura at his heels, Naruto bringing up the rear, stinking like an unhealthy mixture of old, dirty diapers and decaying fish paste. Orochimaru, the blonde concluded, was a scary genius. Even something that seemed as pointless as this genjutsu was incredibly good at eliciting its desired results, if its desired result was to make him question his sanity and torture him with images that couldn't be real. He knew his friends were all dead and yet all he wanted to do was throw his arms around them and cry in relief that they were among the living again. They made their way onto the roof, which had a small area meant for meditation and studying, though it was more often used as a place to eat lunch with friends. Several gray stone arches offered both a little protection from the elements and added to the aesthetically pleasing layout of the area. The sides were lined with trees and perfectly cut granite tiles made up the walkway down the middle. At the far end, 3 steps led down to the small lading before the edge of the building. Kakashi led them to this spot and sat on the railing surrounding the edge of the academy roof while Sasuke sat on the highest step and Sakura took the second step down. Without thinking, Naruto also sat on the second step, ignoring the way Sasuke and Sakura scooted away from him. Now then, Kakashi said, folding his arms across his chest, I'd like you all to tell us a little about yourselves. He noted that 2 of his students were giving him blank stares, though Sasuke was hiding it far better than Sakura. Naruto had apparently gotten bored because he was staring off into space, completely ignoring everything around him. You know, the usual, the Junin began to elaborate, your likes, your dislikes, dreams for the future, hobbies, stuff like that. From what he'd heard about his team, he'd expected Naruto to jump to his feet and answer the question first, eager to be the center of attention for a while. Instead, he sat quietly and continued looking out over the city with an odd expression on his face. As Kakashi again wondered why the genin was acting so different from what the third had told him, Sakura raised her hands and asked, could you go first, sensei? We don't know anything about you. Naruto's eyes flickered in her direction and then quickly snapped back to whatever he was pretending to look at. Kakashi couldn't help but smile. Apparently an old guy, like himself, just wasn't enough to hold Naruto's attention. The boy should have been on Yuhi Kurenai's team instead. Me? Well, my name is Hitaki Kakashi, he started in a neutral voice. I have no desire to tell you guys about my likes and dislikes. Dreams for the future? He paused for a moment and then went on. Well, I have lots of hobbies. With that, he straightened up a little and said, now your turn. How about we start with Stinky there on the right? Sakura leaned over to Sasuke and whispered, so all we learned was his name? Naruto glanced at Kakashi for a moment and then rolled his eyes. This is stupid, he announced. Why are you putting me through all of this? Because if you don't tell me a little about yourself, I won't really know who you are, and it's important for a leader to know his soldiers, Kakashi replied smoothly. Naruto shook his head in annoyance. He had hated Orochimaru for a long time, but this was making things a little too personal. The Sannin should not have been allowed to dig into these sacred memories like this. And yet, Naruto was trapped here, forced to watch everything unfold because the genjutsu of the Mangekyo Sharingan was basically unbreakable. He didn't really want to play along with this sick game, but somewhere, deep down, something seemed to force him to answer. My name is Uzumaki Naruto. I like a lot of stuff I dislike. He stopped himself from saying what he wanted to, took a deep breath and said, I doubt you really want to hear about my dreams for the future. But I will say that I'm really looking forward to unleashing all hell on a snake in the very near future. Kakashi raised his one visible eyebrow in surprise. Naruto's answer was even more peculiar than his behavior up until that point. Of course, it didn't really matter all that much, since he would be getting sent back to the academy or kicked out of the ninja corps altogether in another 24 hours or so. Still, there was a hint of bloodlust in there that Kakashi wasn't pleased to hear coming out of the Kyuubi's container. There was nothing he could do about that at the moment, however, so he turned his eye to Sasuke and said, next. Sasuke's elbows were propped up on his knees and his hands were folded in front of his face. He didn't bother moving them while he answered. My name is Uchiha Sasuke. There are plenty of things that I dislike, not that it matters because there's almost nothing that I like. I don't want to say that I have a dream, but I do have an ambition. I'm going to restore my clan, and also, Sasuke's face suddenly grew colder and his lips pulled back slightly from his teeth as he said, there's a man that I've sworn to kill. Sakura stared at Sasuke in shock and then a look of pleasure appeared on her face, while Naruto shot him a reproachful glare, but kept his mouth shut. Kakashi wasn't remotely surprised by the Uchiha's answer. He would have felt the same way in the boy's position. The Junin turned to Sakura. And finally, the young lady. Sakura blushed bashfully, the slight red in her face seeming more pronounced with her long pink hair, as she said, I'm Haruno Sakura. The thing I like is. Well, the person I like is. Her eyes shifted towards Sasuke, who was pointedly looking anywhere but at her, and her blush deepened. Should I say my dream for the future? She took a deep breath, opened her mouth and then closed it as she began to giggle. There was a brief moment of silence. Naruto was almost angry to see her having been reduced to some sort of Uchihatard, as the boys in his class had called Sasuke's little fan club during their academy days. But then he remembered that back at the academy, Sakura actually was an Uchihatard, one of the Queen Uchihatards, in fact. It hadn't been until later, after they'd been Team 7 for quite a while, that she'd begun to change, and by the time he'd returned from training with Jiraiya, most of it long gone. Though there were moments when the old Uchiha-hearted Sakura reared her ugly head. He'd forgotten how silly and stupid she used to be every time Sasuke so much as looked her direction. Naruto burst into laughter. As sad and infuriating as this day had been, he just couldn't help himself. You know, I'd totally forgotten how much Sakura-chan wanted to jump Sasuke's bones. Kakashi and Sasuke's eyes opened wide at the blonde ninja's crass statement. Sakura gasped audibly and tears started to spring to her eyes. For a moment, Kakashi thought she might get up and run so that no one would see her cry, but instead her eyes quickly narrowed and her face twisted into a menacing scowl. Naruto, she growled and then hurled herself at him, her fist cocked and ready to end his short life. Naruto continued laughing up until the moment her fist was about to connect with his face, and then he leaned back, causing her to miss while he grabbed hold of her arm and yanked her towards him, bringing up his knee at the same time. If his legs had been longer, like he thought they were, his aim would have been perfect, but they weren't, and it wasn't. Instead of her stomach, he was probably going to hit her in either her pelvis or her upper thigh. As it turned out, he hit neither. Kakashi's strong hand closed around Naruto's still damp collar and jerked him back, removing the threat to Sakura while he caught her by the shoulder with his other hand, stopping her fall. Okay, he said in a voice strained by irritation. I think we can all guess what Sakura hates at this point, so why don't we just move on? With a casual flick of his wrist he sent Naruto tumbling against one of the small trees lining the area, and then he gave Sakura a slightly harder than strictly necessary shove to put her back on the step that she'd been sitting on. Naruto ended up lying with his feet in the air against the tree, his back on the hard ground, and his head facing back towards the illusion of his teammates. He slowly rolled over and returned to a sitting position, but did not move away from the tree as he listened to Kakashi explain how many genin would actually become ninja, throw in a few scary comments about their survival training, and warn them not to eat breakfast. It sounded about the same as he remembered it from when it really happened, though far less scary. Sakura looked worried while Sasuke was trying to hide it and mostly succeeding. Kakashi looked happy and Naruto could just imagine the Junin snickering behind his mask at the trick he was playing on the poor genin. Or at least, if they were actually real people, they'd be poor genin. But they weren't, Naruto hurriedly reminded himself. They were nothing more than a clever illusion meant to screw with his brain. As soon as they were dismissed, Sakura gave Naruto one last dirty look and then hurried after Sasuke, who was practically inside already. Soon, only Kakashi and Naruto remained. "Naruto, a word before you go?" Kakashi asked lazily. Naruto smiled and let his arms drop to his sides as he slid his feet slightly apart, ready to strike or dodge at any moment. "I was wondering if you were going to make me keep playing or if we were just going to get it over with already." Kakashi's eyebrow rose and then he shook his head. "I won't ask," he decided. He reached back into a pouch resting on his right hip and pulled something out. Naruto was instantly on guard, shifting his weight forward as he readied his body to dodge whatever was about to come at him. Instead of kunai, exploding tags, or any other sort of weapon, however, Kakashi's hand came forward with a small roll of bills. "Here," he said as he tossed them to the confused boy, "buy yourself some new milk, get something good in your stomach and get a good night's sleep tonight. I don't want to have to put up with you acting like this again, do you understand?" Naruto stared down at the money for a moment and then looked up at Kakashi. "Are you kidding me?" he demanded. "You're not even going to attack me or anything?" When Kakashi only stared at him, Naruto scratched his head and waved his hand dismissively. "Fine, whatever," he sighed. He offered a quick series of exaggerated bows and then, his voice changing to that of a bumbling idiot, said, "I promise, Kakashi-sensei. I'll only drink good milk from now on, bah." Naruto threw the wad of money on the ground, giving it a stomp for good measure before he turned and walked away, tripping on one of the steps, stumbling halfway to the door, and then falling partway down the stairs once he'd entered the building. Kakashi stared after him in wonder and perhaps a little amusement for a moment before collecting the bills and then leaping from the building. Ooh, he wasn't sure where exactly his unstable legs were taking them and he was too lost in thought to really care. He didn't notice the looks he received from the villagers, nor did he hear their taunts when he stumbled or their cries of disgust when they caught a whiff of his stench. He just kept walking. Eventually he slowed and came to a stop, finally looking up, and had to smile at what he found. He was standing in front of the 3 posts of the training area where he, Sasuke, and Sakura had officially become Team 7. A short distance away he could hear the stream gently following its course, and without looking over his shoulder he knew that the large cenotaph was behind him. He couldn't bring himself to turn and look at it, not after all of the names he'd had to order carved into it. Actually writing a few of the names of his precious people himself. If Orochimaru was being accurate, the bluish-green stone wouldn't have half the names that Naruto had seen on it the last time he'd been out here, but if Sakura, Kakashi, Konohamaru, and all the others were on there, he wouldn't be able to take it, not after all of the images he had seen since waking up that morning. So he kept his back to the memorial and walked towards the stream, figuring that he might as well wash his clothing off while he had the chance. Technically, he knew that the water wasn't real and neither were the clothes, the stench, or anything else around him, but he was tired of thinking that he stunk and wanted to feel like he was clean even if it was all an illusion. He stripped out of everything from the waist up and sat down in the grass next to the swiftly flowing water that wasn't real and plunged his jacket into the icy stream, massaging his fingers into the stained fabric in an attempt to work loose whatever was tricking his brain into thinking it stunk. After several moments' work he pulled his jacket out and took an experimental sniff, wrinkling his nose at the stench that still clung to it. Again and again he dunked it, and again it still smelled when it came back up a moment later. The idea occurred to him that it might not be possible to clean away the stench because it was all part of the genjutsu and would therefore keep stinking until Orochimaru decided to make it stop. He was nearly to the point of giving up when he heard a twig snap behind him followed by a small gasp of alarm. Naruto spun around as he rose to his feet and brought up his arms to defend himself, only to find that he had put too much strength into his spin, throwing him off balance and nearly sending himself tumbling into the stream. Fortunately, no attacks came while he collected himself and turned, slowly this time, in the direction of the 3 posts. "I know you're there, so come out," he ordered in a stern voice. He didn't feel any sort of killer intent coming from that direction, but in a genjutsu as complex as this one, that didn't mean anything. He waited another minute and then said, "We both know why you're here, so just come out and get it over with, if you can." Slowly a small head covered in thick dark blue hair peeked around the side of the middle post until one pale, nearly white, eye could be seen. "Hinata-chan?" Naruto asked in surprise, his body relaxing for a moment before he remembered that she wasn't really Hinata and was once again on guard. For a moment the two stared at each other, or rather he stared at her and she stared at a patch of grass near his feet while her cheeks burned in embarrassment, and then Naruto rolled his eyes and sighed. "I guess I should have figured he'd throw you at me eventually." "Is Konohamaru behind one of the other posts? Maybe Eros Sennin and Tsunade Ba-chan are behind the other?" And no, Naruto-kun," Hinata stuttered, still not meeting his eyes. She brought her hands up in front of her chest and began pressing her index fingers against each other, a nervous habit he hadn't seen from her in quite a while. "I am the only one here." Naruto snorted and turned back to his jacket. "Alright, whatever, if you want to come chat with me or if the snake has finally decided to stop messing around and you're here to attack me, feel free. I'll just be cleaning this fake jacket in the fake river to get rid of this damn fake stink." Hinata did not hurry to his side or attack him, but instead slowly inched her way closer to him, as if she were having as much trouble walking as Naruto had been. Finally, she got within about a meter of him and stopped, looking down at his bare back as he worked his jacket over once more in the stream. Hinata felt her face warm even more than it had when she had found him there a few minutes ago and watched him from the distance. Her eyes were naturally incredibly sharp even when her Byakugan wasn't activated. At this range it seemed like she could see every fiber of muscle working just beneath his smooth, tan skin and every droplet of water running down his shoulders and back in. She quickly knelt and watched what his hands were doing, refusing to give in to the temptation to dishonor herself by taking another glance at the rest of his body while he worked. What happened?" she asked finally. Naruto glanced at her, his eyes narrow and dangerous for a moment, and Hinata swallowed hard, ready to leave if he asked, but his face quickly softened. "I can't even feel mad at you when I know you're not real. How weird is that?" "I beg your pardon, Naruto-kun?" the Hyuga asked in confusion. "Never mind, it doesn't matter, I guess," he replied as he turned back to his jacket, lifting it up, smelling it and then jamming it back into the stream with a frustrated grunt. Hinata was quiet for a long time, building up her courage, and then asked in a soft voice, would you like some help?" Naruto lifted the jacket one more time, gave it another sniff and then tossed it in her direction, nearly hitting her in the face with the wet, foul-smelling garment. "Sorry," he mumbled when he noticed her hands quickly come up to intercept it, dirty water still splashing her face. "It is okay," she replied as she wiped the offensive-smelling liquid away with her sleeve. "It was an accident." Naruto shrugged, knowing that it wasn't exactly an accident, but not feeling like arguing with a phantom of his imagination about whether or not he needed to apologize. Hinata, the real Hinata, was the only one of his friends who had lived through most of the war, because her clan had demanded that she be increasingly sheltered as things started to go bad, and especially after Hanabi had died, but even she was dead now. He could dimly remember seeing her body lying in a pool of blood when he found Orochimaru inside Konoha. Her husband had been pinned to a tree not far away, the sword piercing through his back as if he'd been running away at the time of his death. As his thoughts turned to Hyuga Hiroshi, Naruto bit his lip and glanced at Hinata, who was rubbing sand and gravel from the stream bed into his jacket in an attempt to remove the smelly grime. "I know you aren't really Hinata-chan, but would you mind if I said I was sorry for something?" he asked as he picked up his shirt and dunked it in the stream, mimicking her use of the gravel. Naruto-kun, I am Hinata, she replied, refusing to look up. She'd been in the same class as him for a couple of years and hadn't ever managed to talk with him for as long as she had today. If she looked up at him, she just knew she'd mess things up somehow or would lose her ability to speak. If you say so, I just want to tell you that I'm sorry for letting you down all those years ago. You practically asked me to help you, but I never figured out what you wanted me to do. He stopped messing with his shirt and looked down at his hands as they dipped into the water. He'd never apologized to her, the real her, for his failure, though he'd always wanted to. If he could have figured out what she wanted him to do, he could have saved her from her arranged marriage to that asshole, but he hadn't, and she'd paid the price for his failure, just like the rest of his friends. I know it screwed up your life, even when you lied and said you were happy and well. I'm sorry. Hinata took a chance and glanced at him, her eyes filled with confusion, and then she quickly lifted his jacket out of the stream and smelled it so that she had an excuse to think about something else. I don't know why you are talking about, Naruto-kun. You've never failed me. She took a deep breath, her hands shaking nervously, and then added, you inspire me to be better than I am. Naruto sighed wearily and rubbed some water away from one of his eyes with the back of his hand, wincing as he smeared dirt, or worse, into it on accident. With a growl of annoyance he rose and dove into the stream, startling Hinata, who had been unable to look at him after her confession. Naruto seemed to remain under the water for far longer than he should have, by Hinata's estimation, but before she could get truly worried he resurfaced and made his way to the bank, collected a large handful of gravel and rubbed it against his face and chest until droplets of blood were seeping through his fingers. Then he dropped the gravel, dipped once more into the cold water, and then shook himself dry as he stomped back onto the stream bank and plopped down next to Hinata. This is way worse than Itachi's, he commented casually as he lay back in the grass and looked up at the few clouds casually slipping across the sky. At least Itachi made something happen right away. The weight is driving me crazy. Naruto-kun, are you feeling okay? Hinata asked after a moment's hesitation. She'd never seen Naruto act even remotely like he had been since she'd arrived at the training grounds, and she'd certainly never heard of Itachi, whoever that was. It was as if Naruto was playing make-believe. Not really, he grumbled, stupid genjutsu. Genjutsu? Naruto's head rolled to the side and he gave her a reproachful glare. Hinata's eyes fell to the ground and she began picking at her fingers again. I am sorry, Naruto-kun, I don't understand. What genjutsu? Naruto went back to staring up at the clouds and sighed wearily. I guess you wouldn't know about the genjutsu since you're just a part of it. He chuckled silently, the only visible evidence of it being the shaking of his chest. I'm explaining the nature of the world to a figment of my imagination. How stupid is that? Naruto-kun, I am not a figment of your imagination. Again Naruto turned his head and looked at her, his chest bouncing with silent laughter. Prove it. Prove it? Sure. He smiled, prove this isn't a genjutsu to me. How? Hinata asked, suddenly growing worried about what she was getting herself into. I don't know, I'm just a dumb genin, remember? I didn't pay much attention in class, and even when I did I was dead last. Hinata went back to working on his jacket for a moment, using the chore as an excuse not to talk to Naruto and racking her brain for a reason he would be acting so strangely. Though he'd never done it to her, he was known for pulling pranks. Perhaps that was what this was. It didn't seem likely. Naruto's pranks were normally out in the open where everyone could see it. Which was the point, after all. Finally, she looked up from her work, nervously biting her lower lip and said, I don't know how I could prove such a thing to you, Naruto-kun. He was quiet for a moment, his eyes shifting back and forth as he contemplated what to say next. Well, if I'm stuck in a genjutsu, how would I get out? He asked at last. Buying herself more time again, Hinata carefully spread his jacket on the shore to dry. It still smelled a little, but it was hardly noticeable now, and no amount of sand and water were going to make it any better. Iruka-sensei and Kurenai-sensei taught us how to do that last month, she started tentatively, not certain what exactly he wanted her to say. She folded her legs underneath her, sitting properly, and then hesitantly brought her hands together to form the correct seal as she tried to explain how to slow the flow of chakra in his body and then push it out in a burst to disrupt the caster's hold on him and release the genjutsu. Naruto just went back to staring up at the sky. So, he asked when she was finished, what if that doesn't work? How am I supposed to get out then? Kakashi-sensei said that if someone outside of the jutsu releases the jutsu on you or if you could hurt yourself, it should wake you up. I can't wait around for someone to help me, but I guess I haven't tried that second one yet, he conceded. He brought his hand up in front of his face, looked at it thoughtfully for a moment and then grabbed his pinky, twisting and pulling it until there was an audible pop of the finger being forced out of joint. Naruto-kun, Hinata gasped as her eyes widened and she instinctively grabbed his hand before he could damage himself further. It was just as bad as it had sounded, maybe worse. The joint was already beginning to swell and his pinky finger was sitting at an odd angle. Why your finger? He gently pulled his hand away from her, looking perplexed for a moment. It's not a big deal, Hinata-chan. It's not like it won't be healed by tomorrow anyway. He pushed his pinky back into its proper position and then closed his fist, grimacing slightly as the joint popped back into place. Hinata stared at him in stunned silence for a moment longer, digesting the sight of him casually dislocating a finger and then pushing it back in as though it were nothing. She'd seen injuries as severe and even worse during her time at the academy, of course, but never one that was intentionally self-inflicted. You shouldn't hurt yourself like that. Naruto practically laughed in her face. Hey, it was your idea. You said that hurting myself would get me out of a genjutsu. What did you think I was going to do when you told me that? His question stunned her into silence, not that making her quiet was all that difficult. So, do you have any other proofs for me? He asked casually, looking at his hand and watching the swelling slowly begin to dissipate as the Kyuubi's chakra did its thing. Naruto-kun, I don't want to do this anymore, Hinata said after a long pause. She began to get to her feet. Oh, come on, Hinata-chan, stay a little longer, Naruto whined sitting up quickly. He was surprised to find that he actually did want her to stay and talk with him, even if she wasn't really Hinata. This is the most fun I've had all day. Please? Hinata knew that it would be better for her to go. Naruto was acting borderline insane. Even more so than usual, but something in his voice reached her and she found that she couldn't leave. Oh, only if you promise not to hurt yourself anymore. Naruto shrugged. It didn't work anyway, but alright, I promise I won't hurt myself again. So, what else have you got for me? Those were the only ones we were told about in class. Naruto thought about it for a moment, frowning. It seems like there should be a way to figure out if something as big as this was just a genjutsu or not. I mean, what if someone used a genjutsu to make you think you were talking to your friends and you start spilling secrets? Why, you could ask them something only they would know, Hinata pointed out. If they got it right, that would mean that they were who they said they were. Naruto had tuned her out before she'd even finished speaking, his mind running with her idea as soon as he'd grasped the possibilities it held. It would have to be someone that Sasuke didn't know well, as his memories of people were apparently helping Orochimaru's genjutsu achieve the perfection that he'd witnessed so far. Unless Orochimaru had secretly taken a look inside Naruto's old apartment. And someone whose childhood Naruto knew a bit about, since he was supposed to be 12 and all of his peers were acting like they had regressed to that point as well. He knew a lot about Iruka, of course, but he wasn't sure that anything he knew about Iruka or his life story was something that others, particularly Sasuke, wouldn't know as well. Sakura, at the moment, probably wouldn't tell him anything anyway, though she could be a backup candidate as he didn't think Sasuke really knew a lot about her home life or her likes and dislikes or really anything other than what they did when they were together as Team 7, but she wouldn't be the ideal candidate as Sasuke might have known more about her than Naruto realized. Still, she was better than nothing. He could go to Neji and try asking him some personal questions, assuming he could even find him, but the Hyuga genius would be even more of a stick in the mud at this point than he had been in the future. Plus Naruto actually knew things about Neji that he himself didn't even know yet, or wouldn't know if any of this was real, which it wasn't, of course. Besides those few, there really weren't all that many people that he could use. He and his friends had, for the most part, not bothered bringing up their pasts too much and he'd never been one to remember trivial details, actually. He'd never been one to remember details period, regardless of how important they were. Do you have someone that you know well, Naruto-kun? Hinata asked, her voice breaking into his thoughts. Someone that you knew things about that a genjutsu user wouldn't know? She knew that he didn't have many friends, or any really, at least so far as he knew, but perhaps he could go ask Iruka some questions and then would feel better about the realness of the world around him. Yes, she was sure of it. Iruka would set him straight and then Naruto would be back to his old self. Naruto remained still and silent for an impressively long time as he continued to think. Besides Sakura, there was only person whose life he'd ever really gotten to know all that well that Sasuke probably wouldn't have. And he mostly knew things about her because she'd openly told him about them in an attempt to get him talking after the losses started to become too much for him to handle. In fact, she'd continued talking to him about her life and his and anything else she could think to say long after he'd wished she would just go away, sometimes even after he'd asked her to go away, which had surprised him. She'd been there to comfort him after Sakura's death, just like he was there to comfort her as her own teammates and family were killed in the long, brutal war. And, as luck would have it, she was sitting right next to him, nervously biting her thumbnail and trying to look anywhere but at him. "Hey Hinata-chan, what's your favorite food?" Hinata's eyes widened and she swallowed hard. "Me?" she asked in a trembling voice. "Sure," he laughed at her expression. "I don't see any other Hinatas around, do you?" Hinata unconsciously pulled her knees up to her chest and hugged them as the pale skin of her face flushed. "I like sea cinnamon rolls." "Is that it?" Naruto asked, sounding genuinely interested, as though an enjoyment of cinnamon rolls was the most amazing thing he'd ever heard. "I also like senzai," she added softly. He shrugged. "Well, it's not ramen, but I suppose those are pretty good." "What about crab? Do you like crab?" These things were pretty simple, he knew, but it was good to start somewhere and he was getting hungry, so his mind had offered food as a good place to start the questioning. "No, Naruto-kun, I'm sorry, but I don't like crab." "Any special hobbies?" he asked quickly. Hinata couldn't help but glance over at him and was shocked by the sight that greeted her. Naruto had gone from looking moderately interested in what she was saying to staring intently at her, his eyes suddenly wide and almost scared. He seemed to literally be hanging on her every word. She'd never seen him this way. The closest he'd ever come to paying this sort of attention that she'd ever seen was when Iruka was explaining an interesting jutsu or telling the class stories from the old wars. "And nothing special," she admitted, "but, I sometimes like to press flowers." "Why?" There was an urgency in his voice that she didn't think she'd ever heard before, and it was mostly for that reason that she answered the very personal question. "My mother used to do it," Hinata whispered. She'd never told anyone about that, not even Hanabi. As far as she knew, only her father was aware of what her hobby meant to her, though he never said anything about it. Naruto was quiet for a moment, chewing on his lip while he thought, and then he gently asked, "How did your mother die?" Hinata hugged her knees tightly and let her chin rest on them as her pearl-colored eyes stared at the water of the stream. There were complications with her pregnancy with Hanabi-chan. The doctors wanted her to abort the pregnancy. She could feel tears rising in her eyes and tried without success to push them away. For a long time she couldn't continue and Naruto never said a word to force her to, but when she felt certain that her voice would be steady enough to, she pushed on. She refused. And then, after Hanabi-chan was born, she died. "No way," Naruto whispered in a shaky voice, suddenly breathing hard. Hinata turned and looked just in time to see him run both hands through his spiky blonde hair. He had a look of complete and total disbelief on his face. "Naruto-kun?" Naruto's body began to shake and Hinata almost thought he might be crying. It was sweet, she thought, that he could empathize with her loss to such an extent. Sweet, but not exactly typical of the Naruto she knew. She was tempted to reach out and touch his arm, to let him know that as much as the loss of her beloved mother still hurt, she'd come to accept it and mostly focused on the few good memories she had from that long ago. Her hand twitched and she thought she might actually have the courage to do it, but then Naruto threw back his head and burst into maniacal laughter as he laid down and rolled around in the grass, pounding his fists into the ground. She tried to not take it personally, but as his laughter continued unabated for several minutes Hinata couldn't help but feel hurt that he was laughing after she'd told him about her most painful memory, something that almost no one knew. Her father, herself, the clan elders, a few of the older members of the branch house, and a select few from outside the clan, that was it. Not even Hanabi knew what their mother had done for her. And after hearing it, after she'd been braver than she could ever remember having been and told him her most painful memory, after she'd been building up the courage to comfort him when she thought he was actually crying about it, all Naruto had done was laugh long and hard. A wave of hot tears sprang to her eyes despite her attempts to hold them back. She'd never thought that Naruto would act like this. She never thought he'd act at all the way he'd been acting since she was caught spying on him. Maybe he was mad at her for watching him and this was his way of punishing her? It didn't seem like something he'd do, but it didn't matter. She needed to leave before she shamed herself than she already was with her tears. Without a word she rose to her feet and turned to leave as her hands wiped quickly at her tears. Naruto didn't even notice her go. Too overwhelmed was he with the joy, the euphoria, of the knowledge that all that he was seeing was actually real. Somehow, someway, for some reason, he really was in the past, maybe. It was possible, he guessed, that this was still more detail added to Orochimaru's trick, that somehow Sasuke, or Orochimaru, or some sound nin had learned enough about Hinata to fool him and that Hinata had skillfully manipulated him into asking her about her. Naruto sighed, his laughter dying down, and sat up. He supposed there wasn't a way to be perfectly sure about whether or not anything he was seeing was real, but he didn't really care anymore. If Orochimaru was willing to go to such extremes to fool him, he would just have to go with it. He couldn't escape the whatever it was, and he couldn't figure his way out of it, so he was trapped, or free, if everything was real. He would just enjoy it while it lasted, assuming that it was real until there was proof to the contrary. With one last chuckle he rose to his feet, got dressed, and glanced around. Hinata-chan? No one answered and he didn't see her anywhere. That was odd. She'd been there just a moment ago. After a quick survey of the area failed to locate her, he shrugged and began to stumble towards his apartment. Ooh. That evening, with the initial rush of excitement having worn off, Naruto was forced to think about how he'd apparently found himself transformed into a child and transported roughly 2 decades back in time. It only took him a few minutes to tire of the question and set it aside. He couldn't remember much of what had happened to him the day before, other than fighting Orochimaru and a few details about the battle that had engulfed Konoha. And even with what he could remember, none of it seemed to lead to him being sent to the past. He'd never even heard of anything sending someone back in time. Assuming that it really had happened, it would just have to be one of those mysteries that had to be accepted, for now, at least. In an effort to distract himself from an unsolvable mystery, his thoughts turned to what he was going to do to make sure that Konoha wasn't destroyed as it had been in the future. Sadly, these thoughts proved to be just as frustrating. 1,000 ideas swirled around in his head, some ludicrous, some feasible, and some probably impossible. So many people had suffered and died during his lifetime, and now he had the power and the opportunity to make everything perfect for them, but he wasn't sure how to do it. On top of that, the enormity of what he could potentially do was overwhelming. It was a long, dirty, sleepless night for Naruto, and when morning finally came he was no closer to a real answer than he'd been when he finally fell into bed the night before. But, as frustrating as that was, it didn't matter. His friends were all alive once more. He had a second chance at getting things right. Either that, or Orochimaru was laughing that irritating little laugh and jerking him around like a marionette. Very few of the newly graduated genin class slept well that night. 27 students had graduated, 27 students had heard the same basic message from 9 Junin, and 26 students had vowed that they would be one of the 9 taken as official genin. The 27th had other things on his mind at the time. Most of the graduates had gone home to their families that night and told them of the additional test to take place the following morning. Some had received advice from a parent or sibling who were or had been ninja at some point. Others received a kind word of encouragement and assurance that they would do fine. Most were offered diner and a few even managed to accept it and keep it down despite their nerves. A few of the girls declined the diner offer because it was rumored that a certain boy, who was sure to pass, of course, only liked thin women. Only one of the genin was completely unconcerned about the test the next day, and that was only because he'd already passed it and because far more pressing matters were hanging so heavily over him that he could scarcely breathe. Haruno Sakura spent her evening rolling her eyes at her mother and refusing to eat anything that was put in front of her. She'd had a light snack after returning home from the meeting with Kakashi and the rest of Team 7, and that was more than enough food for her unless she wanted to look like her mother in another few years. Her parents, unfortunately, didn't seem to understand how important it was for her to keep the pounds off. Her father had made a joke about how much her stealth skills would improve if she wasted away to nothing. This had caused her mother to declare Sakura too skinny for her own good as she added an extra portion to the plate full of food Sakura was already not eating. Only the fact that she really was very nervous and feeling a little queasy, and that it was readily apparent on her face, kept Sakura from having to eat her weight in pork and steamed vegetables. Once she'd escaped her family, she quickly made her way to her room and locked the door, refusing to come out for the rest of the night lest she find herself tied to a chair while her mother force-fed her some crackers and other foods meant to settle upset stomachs, and put a little weight on silly girls. That night she went to bed early so she could wake up in time to make herself pretty for Sasuke and recheck the survival equipment she'd already packed for the test. Sleep did not come easy, and once it arrived she wished that it had just stayed away altogether. Horrific dreams of the one-eyed Junin grinning through his stupid mask as he informed her that she'd failed assaulted her as she tossed and turned violently under her cotton sheets and thin quilt. She saw Sasuke, who had passed with flying colors, scowling as he looked down his nose at her and shook his head in disappointment before wrapping an arm possessively around the slender waist of blonde, perfect and formerly Sakura's best friend, Yamanaka Ino. He then whispered something into the floozy's ear that caused her to laugh playfully and glance in Sakura's direction as she planted a small kiss on the flawless skin of their mutual crush's cheek. Twice Sakura woke up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding until she realized that it was just a dream and that Sasuke could never like Ino Pig with her snooty, little nose, ugly, boring hair, and, admittedly, fashionable clothes that she only wore to show off her family's modest wealth. Both times she assured herself that Sasuke would see right through Ino and would know what a shallow and annoying person she was. And yet, every time she closed her eyes she saw the same thing. She would fail miserably at all of the different tests Kakashi forced her to take, Sasuke would pass, and then Ino would show up looking smug and stealing Sakura's destined true love. It was enough to drive a girl crazy, and when her alarm finally, mercifully, went off, she was mentally exhausted and didn't feel like her body had gotten any rest at all. Her stomach growled irritably, but a light punch reminded it that there were more important things to think about than food. When she was Uchiha Sakura, she promised to reward her stomach every time her beloved husband took her on a date to one of the expensive restaurants in the village. Soon she was showered, dressed, and looking as good as she could make herself look after a night like the one she'd just had. Her light pink, canvas satchel was stuffed with anything and everything she thought might be required to make it through Kakashi's survival training test, as well as several items purported in her favorite magazines to be useful in keeping herself looking nice even under less than ideal conditions. Without a word to her thankfully still sleeping parents, Sakura made her way into the dimly lit day. She would be a little early, but it was important to show Sasuke and Kakashi how responsible and prepared she was. Plus it would deny her mother another chance to try to feed her, which was always a good thing. Sakura shifted the strap of her heavy bag until it was comfortable and then set out, determined to pass Kakashi's test and win Sasuke's heart. In his expensive, yet somehow cold, apartment, Sasuke also woke early and prepared himself for Kakashi's survival training. He too had spent the night restlessly trying to get comfortable in his large bed and struggling to hold the nightmares at bay. By the time he finally awoke, his silk sheets clung to his sweaty body like flypaper and his dreams remained with him. It would be worthless to kill someone like you, my foolish brother. Even awake those words haunted him, echoing faintly in his ears as the ghost of his older brother's strange eyes floated in his mind. Those eyes, the Mangekyo Sharingan, always seemed to be on him, sometimes taunting him, sometimes frightening him, but always just ahead of him, unreachable and untouchable. Sasuke ran his hands over his face, pushing his fatigue away, and then up through his dark, wet bangs as he took a deep breath and glanced at the clock beside his bed. It was earlier than he needed to wake, but not so early that he shouldn't get out of bed anyway. He had better things to do with his time than dreaming about the past that continued to dog his every footstep. If you want to kill me, hate me, curse me, live a long and unsightly life, run away, and cling to your pitiful life. And someday, when you have the same eyes as me, come before me. Itachi's voice had been so calm when he spoke those words, as if he'd felt nothing for what he'd done to their clan, for what he'd done to their mother and father. He just calmly looked at his little brother who had always idolized him and strived to be as perfect at everything as he was, and said those strange words that Sasuke had thought about every day since. Sasuke quickly made his way to the bathroom and splashed water on his face to clear away the sticky feeling his sweat had left with him. He glanced at the mirror and frowned. How had Itachi felt when he became a genin? He hated thinking about his brother, hated comparing himself to the bastard, and yet he couldn't seem to stop doing it. Had Itachi even been capable of feeling nervous about the test given to see if he was actually allowed to become a full-fledged genin, or had he just been supremely confident in his skills, knowing what a genius he was? Probably the latter. After all, Itachi had only heard how amazing he was from their father every day of his life. It wasn't as if he would have been like the others in Sasuke's class, just looking happy to have graduated and pleased to be on a team. He was an Uchiha, he was bred to be the best and would have accepted nothing less than perfection, and Sasuke was going to be exactly the same. Itachi had been 5 years younger than Sasuke when he graduated, only 7 years old and still top of his class. He'd been allowed to enter the academy earlier, but that was just more proof of his genius. Genin by 7, Sharingan Master by 8, Chunin by 10. Of course, Itachi had been in an entirely different situation than Sasuke was. He'd grown up in the house of the leader of one of the most powerful clans in the village, not on the outskirts of a compound that was now as silent as a graveyard, with a clear view of the empty home he'd loved as a child. Itachi had grown up with a loving mother, a father who favored him, and a brother who idolized him. He hadn't spent half a decade as the last living member of his family, hearing the whispers as he walked down the streets. Itachi had always come home to a family that welcomed him happily. He hadn't ever had to come home and see his clan slaughtered and his parents murdered by the person he looked up to. In short, Itachi hadn't grown up with Itachi as an older brother. Sasuke wished he could say that his painful childhood had hardened him, made him stronger, but he wasn't so sure. He was better than everyone in his class, but he couldn't use the Sharingan yet. He might not even be capable of it. He'd heard rumors, before his clan was slaughtered, that the Sharingan sometimes failed to manifest, even in children who seemed quite talented. Itachi had already had it mastered for 4 years when he was Sasuke's age, and Sasuke didn't even know what it felt like. Itachi seemed so far ahead. How was Sasuke supposed to make up that ground? How was he supposed to avenge his clan when he was stuck with 2 weaklings as team members? He'd known as soon as Iruka had said the teams were designed to be even that he would be carrying his team until he could rid himself of them. He was the strongest of the class in every subject. It was natural that to balance the teams meant he had to be stuck with 2 far weaker teammates. Sasuke allowed a weary sigh to escape his lips and then plucked his toothbrush out of the cup by the sink and began to clean himself up for the day. Uzumaki Naruto and Haruno Sakura. He supposed it could have been worse, but not by much. Naruto was a loud-mouthed idiot who was too dumb and delusional to realize just how weak and pathetic he really was. The fact that he'd passed some sort of special test made it seem like the academy was just trying to get rid of him. Everyone knew most of the Chunin and Junin who ran the academy hated him to some extent. The fact that even his minor offenses and harmless questions sparked their ire only reinforced the notion that they had put up with him for far too long and just wanted him gone. He was deadweight that would just pull down whatever team he ended up on unless someone extremely talented was there to pick up the slack for him. Sasuke wished they could have offered that job to Aburame Shino or Tandoku Yusu, the 2 boys with the next highest average scores in the class. In all likelihood, Naruto would get himself killed fairly quickly, which might also explain why he'd been allowed to graduate despite his horrendous lack of talent, though that seemed a bit cruel no matter how annoying Naruto was. He was too stupid to know when to shut up, so he didn't get killed, and too loud to manage it even if he realized what he needed to do. Sasuke would try to keep him alive as long as he could, especially if such actions helped him get reassigned quicker, but he doubted even he could keep Naruto alive once their missions started involving life or death situations. Sakura was actually rather smart, which only served to make it that much more disappointing to see how weak and dumb she was. Her weakness was obvious from just looking at her, but her test scores showed that she was intelligent despite all appearances to the contrary. Really, he didn't have many bad things to say about her outside of her lack of physical abilities. She followed him around like all of those other harpies, thinking that he actually cared about any of the ridiculous things they did to impress him, fighting amongst each other for the chance to be near him when all he wanted was for all them to go away and leave him alone. They were idiots, every last one of them, and Sakura's associations with them only proved that test scores did not always accurately judge intelligence. Kakashi would be the key. Sasuke would have to impress him right away, Let him see what he was capable of and pray that it was enough to prove that he should be removed from his weak team as quickly as possible and put somewhere more suited to his skills. He was an Uchiha, after all. His clan had been one of the elites, until Itachi. No, he was an Uchiha, he was the Uchiha. His clan was known for their strength in the past, and even that would pale in comparison to the strength he would prove he could possess. He'd been called a genius for years and proven it during every test he'd ever taken. Now it would be time for all that potential to be realized. He would surpass his brother, avenge his clan, and then rebuild the Uchiha to be greater and stronger than they had ever been before. But to do all that, he had to get away from the team he'd been saddled with, and to do that, he had to impress Kakashi during the survival training. As he brushed his teeth and dwelled on his brother, Sasuke slowly became aware of a stinging sensation in his left palm. Curious, he raised his hand and stared at it. His fist had clenched so tightly his fingernails had sliced into his palm, again. He turned on the water, spit the toothpaste out of his mouth, and then calmly set about cleaning his small wounds. It seemed something like this always happened when he thought about his brother, about that night. He just couldn't control the rage he still felt. He buried it deep down during the day, when others were around, but when he returned home to his empty apartment and stepped out onto the balcony to watch the sun on his clan's vacant section of the village, he couldn't hold it in anymore. Digging his fingernails into his palm was fairly minor in comparison with some of the other things he'd accidentally done while thinking of what happened back then. When he was satisfied that the bleeding had mostly stopped, he quickly checked his bag to make sure that he hadn't missed anything when he'd packed the knife before, and then hurried towards the training area Kakashi had told them to meet him at. He would be early, but it didn't really matter. He could be alone out there or alone in here. At least out there he wouldn't be tempted to stare at the vacant buildings that had once housed his family and fellow clan members. Ooh, Naruto did not suffer from nightmares that night, nor did he wake early like his teammates. He probably would have had horrible dreams, waking up screaming or at the very least biting back a scream, and then would have rolled out of bed wearily once it became apparent that sleep wasn't where he needed to be, but he didn't. None of those things happened to him because all of them required him actually falling asleep first. What Naruto did after his conversation with Hinata was head more or less straight back to his apartment, taking the occasional headlong spill into the ground, alleyway walls, old men playing shogi, and one pile of trash bags, pull off his still smelly and slightly wet jacket, not bothering with his pants or shirt, crawl into bed, and stare up at his cracked ceiling as the shadows swallowed up the room and then began to retreat again many hours later. He neither saw nor heard anything around him as all of his attention was on the unique, to his knowledge, at least, situation he found himself in. Had any enemy ninja entered his apartment, tripped over his table, cursed loudly, realized they'd forgotten the tools of their trade, left to get those tools, and come back again later to kill him, he would have been a dead man, or child, or whatever he was. After dwelling for a long time on what he could do to fix things, he'd eventually worked his way back towards the question of how he'd been transported back in time in the first place. After many hours of thought, it was still a mystery to him. He remembered fighting Orochimaru, and losing, much as he hated to admit it, but other than that things weren't very clear. He remembered the Mangekyo Sharingan, and the bodies of Hinata and that prick she'd had to marry, but that was about all the detail he could recall other than the fact that the village had obviously been attacked and was in the process of being even more destroyed than it already was after years of warding off attacks. Once he'd tired of that subject, he again turned to the question of how sure he was that he truly was in the past and not stuck in a genjutsu or some other trick. This question actually grew easier to answer the more he thought about it, which was a pleasant change from the rest of his evening. Even if he was trapped in a genjutsu, there was no way Orochimaru or Sasuke or anyone else from Otogakure would have known about Hinata's mother or any of those other things Hinata said. She just wouldn't have been important enough in their eyes to get that sort of information. On top of that, he doubted there was a genjutsu powerful enough to recreate everything from his childhood so accurately. Even things he'd forgotten about until seeing them again in this Konoha were perfect, it just wasn't possible. And the final part that officially made this, in his mind, real, was the fact that no one had attacked him besides two old men who didn't appreciate him ruining their shogi game with his clumsiness. Large, highly detailed genjutsu were extremely taxing on the caster's chakra reserves, Itachi's Tsukuyomi could only be used a few times and even then only for a few seconds each time. And this would be the biggest, most highly detailed genjutsu Naruto had ever heard of, and yet he was completely unmolested so far. No, this was definitely real. Naruto was sure of it, mostly, sort of. It was the other question, the one that he kept coming back to over and over, that was the most difficult to answer, which explained why he spent so much time thinking about it. Unfortunately, the question of how to make sure the future he came from was never allowed to happen only brought more questions with it. How much could he change? Could he actually change anything? What changes should he make, assuming he actually could make real changes? There were a lot of things in his life that he'd always wished that he'd done differently, or better, or not at all, but now that he had the chance to make those changes, he wasn't completely sure how to go about doing it. On top of it all, he couldn't let anyone know who or what he was. He knew enough about the way the village worked to know that if he suddenly developed an amazing array of abilities, people would notice and start asking hard-to-answer questions. If they learned that he thought he was from the future, he'd either end up strapped to a bed in the hospital for the rest of his life or would find himself sitting in a chair staring up at the scarred face of Morino Ibiki for the rest of a much shorter life. He wasn't even sure which of those scenarios was actually worst. Naruto sighed and rubbed his hands against the strangely smooth skin of his face. He'd always been a baby face, but over the years had gradually built up the ability to at least grow some stubble. Now his face was back to its previous smoothness and he was rather glad for it. Being unable to grow a decent beard or goatee, and being reminded of it by several friends, from time to time, took all of the fun out of having facial hair and turned it into just another chore that had to be done. He'd always thought having a beard like Osamu's would have been cool, but it was not to be. There were female members of the village council who could grow more facial hair in a week than Naruto could manage in 3 months. And with that pleasant thought, Naruto sat up and yawned, deciding that it would be better to get going than sitting around trying to plan how he was going to live his life the second time through. He'd never been good at planning for the future, he'd always just sort of ad-libbed it as he went along. It made him unpredictable, the number one unpredictable ninja of Konoha, as Kakashi used to call him, but also meant that he had to rely heavily on his friends when in-depth plans were required. The blonde looked down at his orange pants and blue shirt and sighed forlornly. It would be obvious that he'd slept in his clothing, except for his jacket that was lying crumpled on the floor, and that he hadn't gotten the stink completely out of them, despite Hinata's best efforts. He would have to work on it again that evening, after he'd passed Kakashi's little test, and his sheets would need a good cleaning as well. Naruto stretched and scratched himself lazily as he headed into the small kitchen and opened the door to the beat-up refrigerator. I'd forgotten how bad it was, he groaned as he stared at the measly pickings. The milk was obviously bad, he could smell it the moment he opened the door. At one time in his life, he probably would have figured that it was close enough to good and drank some, having heard of the importance of calcium and vitamin D early in his academy days. You just had to hold a fork up to keep the chunks from ending up in your cup and it was fine. There was a half-eaten apple, but it was shriveling up and turning brown, and Naruto wasn't sure if he'd be able to actually force himself to eat it. The rest of the items in the refrigerator were either unidentifiable, unappealing, or both, so he shut it in disgust and began to search the rest of the kitchen for some decent food. It was strange to realize how spoiled he'd become once he actually had friends who looked out for him. As a child he wouldn't have minded his lack of options, he might have even thought he was eating pretty well, but after years of living off the home cooking Hinata occasionally brought for him, having had the chance to sample some of Sakura's more edible attempts at meals, and being invited to have dinner and lunch with the families of other friends, he'd had his eyes opened to what a homemade meal was supposed to be, and it wasn't going to be found in this refrigerator. Fortunately, he only had to open 2 cabinet doors before he hit the jackpot. 6 unopened, beautiful cups of instant ramen sat before him. The oven couldn't heat the water fast enough. In mere minutes Naruto was pouring the boiling water into one of the cups and inhaling the intoxicating scent of his favorite food as the water softened the noodles and released their trapped aroma. With a heartfelt "Itadakimasu," he dug his chopsticks into the beautiful noodles and brought them up to his watering mouth, and then paused. He wasn't supposed to eat. Kakashi had told them not to, and the first time around he had obeyed. Normally, Naruto would have simply thought, "Screw you," at the Junin and enjoyed his less than healthy breakfast, but there was a problem in doing that. His team had passed Kakashi's test the first time around and they needed to pass again or everything would get really screwed up. If they didn't pass the test, they wouldn't be Team 7, and if they weren't Team 7 they wouldn't go to Wave Country, and if they didn't go to the Wave Country they might not be entered into the Chunin exam, and if they didn't take the exam, Naruto wouldn't have met Gaara and Jiraiya, and if he didn't meet Jiraiya, Tsunade Ba-chan might not become the Hokage. No, he had to do everything just like he had before. He couldn't remember all the details from way back then perfectly, but he had to be close enough to get the same outcome. If he started changing things that didn't need to be changed, everything could be ruined. With a heavy heart, Naruto let his chopsticks sink into the steaming bowl of noodles and then picked up his ramen, carried it to the sink and mournfully poured it out. Watching the noodles and broth slide down the drain and out of sight was nearly the saddest thing he'd ever seen. Well, actually, not even close, but it was the saddest thing he'd seen since waking up in the past and that was enough. Naruto let out a forlorn sigh and cast a longing glance back at the cupboard that held the wondrous stash of ramen, and then headed out the door and towards the training grounds. If he was going to be hungry, he might as well be hungry somewhere that didn't have a ready supply of ramen softly calling out to him like a siren amongst the rocks. Ooh. Naruto was the last member of Team 7 to arrive at the training grounds, having been delayed numerous times by trips and stumbles as his too short body was unable to comply with the instructions of a brain used to wielding far longer and more powerful limbs. He was, at least, encouraged by the fact that his stumbles were occurring less frequently than they had the previous day. Slowly but surely his mind was adapting to its new, or old, body, though the key word there was slowly. So long as he remained totally focused on his movements he was generally fine. Unfortunately it was really hard to keep thinking about the correct distance for each step, how quickly his arms were moving, or the distance from his hand to his face. Those sorts of movements were instinctive for a reason, they were boring. Of course, tripping and falling on top of a little, old woman out for an early morning stroll, being called a pervert, and getting hit repeatedly until an escape was managed were the results of his inattention, along with even dirtier clothes, a mouthful of mud, and a severely bruised ego. So perhaps he should have been able to put a little more effort into watching what he was doing. It was just so hard for him to pay attention when he kept seeing buildings that had been destroyed years earlier suddenly returned to their former glory and people that had been killed during one of the many attacks on the village going about their business as if there was nothing strange about it, and for them, he supposed, there wasn't. When he finally made it to the training grounds, his teammates looked as though they'd already been there for a while. Sasuke was sitting at the base of a tree, his satchel placed between his bent legs, his arms resting on his knees, and a bored expression on his face. A gentle breeze played with his long, dark bangs, causing them to sway in front of his face in a way that Naruto had to admit appeared to be simultaneously unintentional and unquestionably cool-looking. Seeing his old friend as he had been and being unaffected by the jealousy that had often dictated his actions and views as a young man, Naruto could see what the girls liked about the Uchiha. He was handsome, or at least Naruto assumed that he was, finding it a bit unpleasant to think of another guy as handsome, and something about his perpetual brooding made him seem mysterious and aloof. His features were almost delicate from one angle, but then hard as ice from another. "What are you looking at, Dobi?" Sasuke asked, noticing Naruto's stare. "I just realized why all the girls liked like you," Naruto replied with a grin. The seated boy snorted, "Don't get any ideas, I don't swing that way." Naruto opened his mouth to protest, or perhaps to challenge Sasuke to a fight, but before he could say anything Sakura yelled, "Quit bothering Sasuke, idiot." Sasuke rolled his eyes and muttered something under his breath before turning his head away from his teammates and looking up at the branches above him as the early morning sunlight danced in the leaves. Naruto frowned and glanced in Sakura's direction. "I think you're bothering him more than me," he retorted before he could stop himself. Sakura's eyes hardened dangerously and her lips pulled back to reveal her clenched teeth as she advanced on him. It could have been his imagination, but Naruto thought that he might have even heard her knuckles popping as her hands squeezed into fists. "Ah, ha ha, Sakura-chan, don't do anything you'll regret later," he said, gesturing placatingly with his hands. "I won't regret this," she announced in a deadened voice. "You've had this coming for a long time. Sakura-chan, I don't want to hurt you," he tried again, his arms relaxing slightly as he prepared to defend himself. "But if you try to hit me." He knew there was going to be power behind her fist, there always was. But it came at him so pitifully slow it was almost hard to take it seriously. As a child, he'd often been blindsided by such attacks, his eyes unable to follow them, but this time he could see it coming with ease. His right arm shot out instinctively to knock her fist away. But his hand didn't travel far enough to make contact with her arm. A half-second later, her fist slammed into his head, sending him tumbling through the grass and dirt. For a long minute, Naruto lay in a heap, covered in grass and dust and not moving, perhaps not even breathing. Then he coughed, spitting sod from his mouth, and rolled onto his back, one hand coming up to rub his aching face. "Damn it, Sakura-chan," he grumbled, gingerly touching the large lump that was already forming on his head as he sat up. "I forgot you were such a—" "What was that?" the pink-haired Kunoichi snarled as she rounded on him again, her eyes twitching. Naruto swallowed the comment instantly and smiled innocently up at her. "Nothing. Make sure it stays that way." Naruto nodded hastily, not wanting anything more to do with her angry side until his body was working properly. It was actually, in a vague and mostly made up so he'd feel better about himself sort of way, a good thing that she'd punched him. He'd been able to see her fist coming and could have dodged it or blocked it if his arms and legs would consistently do what he asked of them. Seeing how much of a hindrance his body was going to be in battle helped him see what he would have to work on first. After all, it would be difficult to save all of his friends if he was constantly tripping and misjudging distances. It also worked as a convenient excuse to not start trying to make any changes right away since he had no idea where to begin. His blue eyes followed Sakura as she once again attempted to strike up a conversation with Sasuke and met only silence, small grunts, and a few one-word answers. As a child, Naruto had suspected that Sasuke secretly enjoyed Sakura's attention and even encouraged it, but looking at it now, he saw nothing but annoyance from the dark-haired boy. Perhaps it just hadn't started yet, or maybe he'd seen something that wasn't there because he'd wished that it was him she'd paid so much attention to. Whichever was the case, Sasuke looked to Naruto like he just wanted to be left alone, which was exactly what couldn't happen. If Sasuke was allowed to be the loner that he wanted to be, then he would be that much more willing to leave the village in search of power in less than a year. Sasuke's ties to the village had been nearly severed by his brother's betrayal, and then the last few were ripped away by Orochimaru and the Curse Seal. What he needed was a few stronger ties. Naruto liked to think that he had been one, but if he was, it wasn't enough. Sasuke needed something more than a little brother and a semi-rival. Naruto wasn't sure what his friend needed, but he would have to figure it out quickly. If he didn't and things went the same at the Chunin exam as they had the first time around, he would have to do what was needed to protect the village. Even if it meant killing one of his best friends. It was a chilling thought and Naruto hated himself for even thinking it, but it was true nonetheless. He would kill Sasuke before allowing him to betray the village a second time, especially after having lived through the consequences. Naruto pushed those thoughts from his mind quickly and vowed to only worry about the here and now for the time being. The Chunin exam was still a long ways off and he would come up with a plan before then. It was as simple as that. Right now the most important thing to think about was getting his mind back in control of his body. For the next 2 hours Naruto sat cross-legged on the ground, bringing one arm up slowly until it was where he wanted it and then lowering it back down, over and over again, slightly faster each time. Once he thought he had the timing down he would work on the other arm until he was satisfied with that one. Then he would return to first arm and see if he still remembered how to move it, and was disappointed when he found himself nearly back at square one. It wasn't that he couldn't figure it out, his head knew more or less how to move his body after the first several times he worked through the movement, but his instincts still wanted to use his larger form, and instincts that had been built up over the years couldn't be trained out of him with just a few minutes or even a few hours of work. After he gave up on his arms he stood up and began pacing, measuring his footsteps at one speed and then at another, always keeping his eyes down on them to make sure he didn't trip or try to take a larger step than he was capable of. Sakura and Sasuke, who was now up in a tree to avoid having to talk with anyone, watched his antics curiously for a while before eventually passing it off as just another Naruto being weird moment. There had been plenty of them over the years. Sakura told him to just sit still at one point, but he didn't even look up at her or reply, and she couldn't work up enough anger to do anything about it. The truth was that she was getting restless as well. Kakashi was now over 2 hours late and she'd gotten to the meeting spot almost an hour early. Were Sasuke not around, she would have taken up pacing and fidgeting as well. He was around, however, and she didn't want to annoy him or be seen acting like Naruto. So instead she sat at the base of the tree Sasuke was in and dozed while watching Naruto. Ooh. Kakashi had woken long before any of his genin. He was already at the hero's monument before the sky had changed with the coming of dawn, and he was still there when he noticed that his students had made their way to the spot he'd told them to meet him at, just on the other side of the trees that surrounded the cenotaph. His instructions had been for them to meet him at 7:30, but all three had shown up early, just like he would have when he was fresh out of the academy. He could have gone and seen them at any time, but he didn't. After realizing that they were there waiting for him, his body seemed to try to pull him towards them, desperate to be close to on time for once, but he resisted, forcing himself to stare at his friend's name, tracing it with his eyes over and over. The large stone was exactly as it had always been, cold and smooth, somehow simultaneously seeming to reflect the growing light of the morning and suck in all of the light around it. Kakashi knew it was just his imagination that it did this, brought on by the fact that he knew a great many of the names that were carved into its glossy surface, but the stone gave him the creeps and he hated it. Still, every morning, and occasionally during the evening as well, he came and stood before it until he was late to wherever he was supposed to go, punishing himself for the person he once was and recalling in near-perfect detail the mission that claimed his best friend's life. "I've got a new team, Obito," he whispered. "Hokage-sama asked me to take them, just like he does every year, and I had to say yes. One of them is from your clan and another is supposedly a loud-mouthed dumbass. That's why Hokage-sama gave them to me. I doubt they'll pass though. The loud one followed me all over the village yesterday when we were supposed to head straight to the academy and never even asked why we kept wandering around in circles." Kakashi let out a soft sigh and looked up at the sun overhead, noting that it was approaching 11 already. 3 hours should be about right, don't you think? I thought about telling them that I was helping an old lady who'd gotten lost, but I've decided just to go with the "my alarm clock broke" routine. The old lady one is sort of special. I was always fond of that one when you used it. No, actually, it drove me crazy when you used it, but I'm fond of it now. It was the last excuse for being late that I ever got to hear you give. He turned and began walking towards his team, calling over his shoulder, "I'll see you tomorrow and let you know how badly it went." Ooh. Another 30 minutes had passed before the sound of movement through the bushes caught the attention of two of the three genin. Naruto continued his strange pacing and didn't even bother looking away from his feet at the noise. Sasuke and Sakura looked up just in time to see Kakashi step into the clearing, a small backpack on his back and a little skip in his steps. "Hey guys, good morning," he said with a happy wave. "You're late," Sakura yelled back, seeing red. If Kakashi wasn't going to show up until after 10, why had he told them to meet him there at 7:30? "Oh, yeah, sorry about that," he chuckled, not sounding very sorry at all. "My alarm clock broke and I overslept." "By 3 hours?" Sakura asked in disbelief and then added in a whisper that she didn't realize he could hear, "What sort of Junin are you?" Kakashi's eyes shifted away from her and she could imagine the corners of his mouth twitching under his mask. Anyway, come over here and we'll get started." He signaled for them to follow him and then led them down a small path through the woods that led to an open space surrounded by trees on 3 sides with a small river on the 4th. 3 wooden posts were stuck into the ground near the path with a large, cut stone monument just beyond them. Kakashi removed a small black alarm clock with golden bells from his backpack and set it on the middle post. Sakura noted that this clock seemed to be working just fine and was set to the correct time, before pressing a button on top of it, setting the alarm. The Junin then turned towards the 3 young ninja and held up his hand. 2 silver bells dangled from 2 pieces of string. "Here are 2 bells," Kakashi informed them needlessly. "Your task is to take these from me before noon. Those who cannot get a bell by noon will get no lunch." He smiled through his mask at them. "I'll not only tie you to one of these posts, but I'll eat right in front of you." Right on cue, all 3 genin's stomachs growled loudly and Kakashi looked even more pleased as he watched realization dawn on 2 of the 3. Naruto either didn't notice or didn't care, but he smiled knowingly as he too glanced at his teammates. For a moment Kakashi wondered if the boy had figured out the reason for the rule and still went without eating, but dismissed the idea just as quickly. Everything he'd heard about Naruto said that the boy was hopelessly clueless, his boundless energy making him unable to concentrate long enough to fully understand even the simplest of puzzles or instructions. Of course, if one read between the lines of many of those reports, it wasn't difficult to see a rather intense dislike of the boy coloring the opinions of most of his teachers, but if he'd figured it out, he should have eaten like an intelligent person. You only need to get one bell, he continued, allowing his thoughts on Naruto to slip to the back of his mind. Obviously there are only two, so one of you will definitely be tied to a stump and the person who doesn't take a bell, fails. Kakashi gave the strings a small tug and the bells tinkled tauntingly at his potential students. At least one of you is headed back to the academy no matter what. Once again he watched their faces carefully as they realized what he was saying. This time Sakura inhaled sharply at the news. Sasuke's eyes narrowed, and once again Naruto seemed not to care very much. Kakashi's hand closed around the bells and he stood up a little straighter. Use your shrunken and whatever else you want. You won't succeed unless you come at me with the intent to kill. But you'll be in danger. Sakura objected. Naruto looked down at the kunai holster on his right thigh, judging the distance carefully, and then let his fingers slip into it. The moment they closed around the ring of one of his kunai, he drew it out and flipped it underhanded at Kakashi with surprising speed, though little accuracy. Kakashi watched it sail over his shoulder, missing him by a good 10 centimeters, and then turned back to the group. Well, he doesn't have much aim, but at least Mr. Dead Last has got the right idea. Trust me, the only ones in danger out here are you three, so I'll say it again. If you don't come at me with the intent to kill, you stand no chance of getting a bell. Naruto scowled at the Mr. Dead Last comment, but more so at his aim. He'd done such a good job getting his hand into the holster, but it still wasn't good enough. He had to be able to do it without thinking and he had to be able to use his weapons accurately. In his current state, he stood no chance against Kakashi or anyone else for that matter. Fortunately, he didn't have to beat Kakashi today, he just had to make sure that everything happened the way it had before and they would be fine. Well, maybe not the butt-poking thing. He didn't care how much it screwed up the timeline. Naruto was not going to let Kakashi do that a second time. We'll start when I say, Kakashi continued. Ready, start. Oh, we'll start when I say, Kakashi continued. Ready, start. As they had the first time around, Sasuke and Sakura were instantly off and moving into a hiding position. Naruto also duplicated his actions from the first time he took the test, remaining where he was and looking at his future. Or past, sensei. This time around, however, it was more because he didn't trust himself not to smash headlong into a tree or impale himself on a branch than a desire to prove his own worth. Had he thought about it, it might have occurred to him that it was a good idea to do what he had done before since it worked out well for him the first time around, but he didn't think about it. One of the ninja basics is to be able to hide yourself well, Kakashi said in a bored voice, his one eye half closed and his hands in his pockets. So what exactly are you doing? Naruto shrugged and looked around. It's not like you don't know where they are, he pointed out, or at least, I hope you know where they are, since I do and I'm only a genin. He glanced towards the tall oak tree that he'd seen shake as Sasuke moved along its branches. Besides, I'm not scared of you. Kakashi's eyebrow rose, but the expression on his face remained just as bored as ever. Naruto wanted to laugh and cry at the same time as he watched Kakashi with an insight he wished he'd had the first time around. The posture, the hand in the pocket, the half-closed eyelid, the slack face. They all worked perfectly together to convey his apparent total disrespect for whoever he was facing. It was no wonder Maida Guy found Kakashi so irritating when they had their battles. If you aren't scared, then why don't you come get a bell? Kakashi asked with a yawn. Naruto hesitated for a moment as he tried to remember everything about this first test that he could. Sadly, his memory offered very little information. So much had happened to him in such a short period of time that he'd never sat down and really tried to commit any of it to memory. What was the point when so many other exciting and memorable things were going on around him? He did remember fighting with Kakashi on this date, however, and he also remembered the painful and humiliating outcome of that short, one-sided battle. He was not letting Kakashi do that to him again. But if he didn't fight Kakashi because he knew he was sure to lose thanks to the small body he still hadn't completely mastered, would everything else still happen the way it had the first time around? What if he didn't fight and the three of them ended up failing and being sent back to the academy and were split up the next time around? How could he protect his best friends if he never actually got to know them? Perhaps he could avoid having Kakashi violate him that way a second time and still keep things going the way they were supposed to. He'd have to fight the Junin, but so long as he avoided the super powerful ass poke, as Sakura so deftly named it, it wouldn't be too bad. Plus, Kakashi had once told him that it hadn't been until the Wave Country mission that he had really started to see Naruto's potential as a ninja. Up until that point he'd been just another loudmouth who tried hard, sort of, but basically just screwed everything up. It wasn't that he hadn't liked Naruto, far from it actually, he hadn't been able to see past the jokes and apparent stupidity to see what a powerful ninja the blonde could become. Naruto supposed that as long as he didn't pull out anything too fancy, or advanced, or previously unheard of, it wouldn't hurt anything to show off just a little. It wasn't like he was going to use demon chakra or summon a frog or anything. If he could impress him today, perhaps he could speed the respect process up a little and take just a tiny bit of the spotlight from Sasuke so that it wouldn't be such a shock to his friend later. It could work, he decided, but really, after the frustrating past 2 days, the annoying lack of control of his body, and the fact that people who would someday be his friends or at least respect him all looked down their noses at him as though he were something nasty the dog had dragged in, left him spoiling for a fight anyway. Naruto pointed a finger at Kakashi and yelled, "I'm going to make you see just how amazing I'm going to be, sensei. And then someday you'll get to tell you little grandbabies that you helped train the Rokudame Hokage while they sit on your lap wearing weird masks, their hiteatesh covering one eye, and their gray hair sticking up all over the place." He grinned confidently, certainly more confidently than he felt, and cracked his neck as his muscles tensed, preparing to launch him into action, or a tree, depending on how well he concentrated. "I'll have you know that my hair is silver, not gray," Kakashi retorted as he reached behind him into the canvas pouch hanging from his belt and pulled out an orange book with a picture on the cover of a young man chasing after a woman with a larger chest than her shirt was meant to carry. "Come whenever you like, it's been a while since I've taught taijutsu, but from what I've heard of you, you could probably use the lesson." Naruto smiled even wider at the sight of Icha Paradise and the memories that suddenly flashed through his mind of his time with Jiraiya. He reached down into his kunai holster and placed his middle finger through the rings of 3 of the throwing knives. With a flick of his wrist, all 3 kunai shot straight in the general direction of Kakashi. The first 2 that left his finger fell short of their target, landing in the grass a good meter before Kakashi would even have had to think about moving. The last came off with a little more velocity, but left his hand too late and landed in the bushes way to the left of the Junin. Actually, the only person Naruto came close to hitting was Sakura, who was left staring wide-eyed at the blade buried in the dirt right in front of her nose. Sorry, Sakura-chan," Naruto called out as the bush shook with not quite suppressed rage. "Are you sure you want to be a ninja?" Kakashi asked, never looking up from his book. "You seem to be more dangerous to your teammates than you are to your enemies." Naruto scowled, his hands clenching into tight fists. "Ah, shut up Kakashi-sensei, that was just an accident. Give me a few days of practice and I won't ever miss again," he shot back. "I don't think even a few years of practice will help your aim. Are you sure you're going to be the Rokudame? Perhaps you should be aiming to become the Hachidame, though even that might not give you enough time to become competent." Naruto's scowl deepened and his annoyance grew despite his knowledge that he was being suckered into attacking. Being underestimated and looked down upon was one of those things that he just couldn't abide, no matter who it was coming from or how much of it was made to provoke a response from him. With a burst of chakra to his legs he raced towards his teacher, bringing his hands together as he called out, "Kage Bunshin no Jutsu." 5 Narutos leapt into the air and descended upon Kakashi, who merely giggled lecherously and turned the page. A single Naruto held back, watching as the others attempted to land a blow on their future teacher and friend. And attempt was about as far as they really got. 2 of the clones collided as they came down on him, one having misjudged his leg strength and the other having just chosen a bad angle, and vanished in a poof of smoke as the other 3 managed to at least hit the ground properly. The next 2 disappeared as they punched from either side of Kakashi, only to have the Junin kneel down and tighten the strap on one of his sandals. And the fifth met his end when he sent a beautiful kick at Kakashi's face, but misjudged the distance and hit nothing but air. The momentum of the kick threw him off balance and he slipped on the grass, falling back and cracking his head against a stone on the ground. Kakashi didn't even bother commenting on Naruto's ineptitude this time around, he merely continued to read in silence. The final Naruto rolled his eyes and dashed at the gray-haired Junin, vowing to at least land one blow before the fight was over. He started out with a punch at Kakashi's head, which was easily blocked with a single hand. The momentum of the block dictated a kick out of Naruto and he gladly obliged, spinning in the air and sending his foot straight for Kakashi's neck. Kakashi ducked casually and Naruto's spin carried him down to the ground. Damn it, the boy growled as a kunai fell from his holster. His feet hit the grass for only a split second before he once again shot towards his now crouching teacher, one fist raised. It was as his fist started forward that he saw Kakashi's leg muscles flex as chakra was pushed into them. The blonde ninja's bright blue eyes watched in horror as the Junin sidestepped the attack and moved behind him, still crouching, his fingers coming together as if he were forming a tiger seal. Kakashi had led him by the nose through the whole fight. His every stance, every block, every movement had pushed Naruto into the spot he now found himself in. Off balance, with his butt just asking for the pain it was about to receive. Naruto! Sakura yelled from the bushes, her voice terrified. Get out of there, you're going to get killed. Naruto instinctively turned towards the bushes, feeling as though he were moving in slow motion. It's already too late, Kakashi whispered from behind him as he brought his arms back and prepared to strike. Hidden Leaf Ancient Taijutsu Supreme Technique, 1,000 Years of Death. His arms shot up and into Naruto's butt, lifting the boy off the ground for just a second, and then the blonde vanished into a cloud of smoke. Kakashi's eye widened. What the? The kunai that had fallen from Naruto's holster before his final attack disappeared just as the blonde in the air did, revealing a safe and unviolated Naruto. The blonde lifted a kunai and held it to the Junin's back as he reached out to snatch a bell from his belt. Sorry, sensei, but I'm not as dumb as you think I am, he grinned. No, a voice replied from behind him as the bell in his hand and the Kakashi in front of him disappeared, but you're close. Hidden Leaf Ancient Taijutsu Supreme Technique, 1,000 Years of Death. Redux. Naruto had only a split second to look shocked before pain ripped through his butt and he was sent flying into the stream. As he sank into its depths, clutching his butt and yelling unintelligible curses that appeared as nothing more than bubbles, he could only wonder why he had fallen prey to the move again, even knowing more or less what was going to happen. He had never been one to believe in fate, but for the briefest of moments, he couldn't help but wonder if such a thing actually existed. Kakashi watched the bubbles on the surface of the water until they slowed and then vanished. He didn't look away until a moment later when he saw an oddly colored object begin to swim downstream and towards the shore. Well, I hope he knows how to swim, he commented just loud enough to be overheard by the two genin hiding in the bush and tree. If not, then I might not get to fail anyone today. Ooh. Sasuke watched until it became apparent that Naruto wasn't going to resurface and then quietly made his way into the surrounding area to set up his trap. Kakashi was clearly too fast and too strong to be taken down by normal means. There would have to be some brains behind any attack against him. As he silently tied back branches and slipped a few kunai into them, he thought back on Naruto's fight with Kakashi. Naruto had been shockingly good, at least compared to what Sasuke had expected out of him. The fact that he could produce a solid clone at all was pretty impressive. To create 6 and transform himself to avoid an attack was nothing short of amazing. And yet, Kakashi hadn't been fooled even for a second. He'd toyed with Naruto, let him think that he had succeeded, and then humiliated him. Naruto had been stupid to leave himself open to any sort of attack, just assuming that his simple little plan would be enough to win him a bell. He knew a powerful jutsu, but he was too dumb to think through his strategy far enough to actually use his jutsu effectively. Sasuke's lips pulled back into a smile as he tied off another branch. This little test was perfect. Sakura and Naruto stood no shot of getting a bell, which meant that they would both have to go back to the academy. All he had to do was get a bell and he'd be free of them. The last of his traps secured, he quietly moved back to his hiding spot to watch Kakashi for an opening. The means of achieving his ambition was so close he could taste it. It only took a moment for him to see what he was looking for. Kakashi yawned and tilted his head to the side, rubbing the stiffness out of his neck, and then stretched as he let out another yawn. Sasuke drew his weapons so fast they almost seemed to have appeared in his hands by magic. With perfect accuracy, he let them fly and watched with satisfaction as they hit their target in the back. Only to have Kakashi vanish in a puff of smoke as a kunai-riddled log fell to the ground. Damn it, he knows where I am, the Uchiha thought as he scurried away from his hiding spot. Ooh. Kakashi's flippant treatment of Naruto's possible demise drove a stake of fear through Sakura's heart. Was it possible that their Junin was allowed to kill them during this test? It hadn't said anything about that in any of the books she'd read, nor had anyone told her about the dangers of trying to become a ninja. They'd warned her about the dangers after she was a ninja, but not before. This test was barbaric. How could the village allow such a thing to take place? She hoped that Naruto was still alive. Swimming was part of basic training, after all, but at the moment that wasn't really her concern. She needed to find Sasuke. After his failed attack on Kakashi, which had also scared her for a moment when she thought it might have succeeded in killing the Junin, she had hurried out of her hiding place to look for him. Kakashi would have figured out where he was at from the path of the kunai and would be attacking him next, no doubt. If she could help him, or even save him, it was sure to do wonders for their relationship. She tried to remain hidden, dashing from bush to bush and tree to tree, but it was difficult to look for someone when you were hiding, and finally she gave it up for lost and simply hurried as quietly as possible through the woods, wishing she had shorter hair so it wouldn't keep getting snagged on low-hanging branches. Sasuke-kun, she thought as she ran, where could you be? And then a sickening thought struck her. What if Kakashi-sensei has already gotten Sasuke-kun? No, she wouldn't believe that. She couldn't believe that. Sasuke was the best, that sort of thing couldn't possibly have happened to him. Sakura glanced around a tree as she raced past it and stopped in her tracks before diving back behind the trunk for cover. Kakashi was standing just a little ways away, calmly turning a page in the orange book he'd been reading while he fought Naruto. She chanced another peek at him and sighed with relief. He was still standing there, apparently not aware that she was so close by. Sakura, behind you, Kakashi's voice whispered in her ear. She glanced over her shoulder just in time to see the Junin form a seal with his hands, and then the world seemed to vanish in a swirl of leaves. Ooh! Naruto pulled himself up onto the rocky ledge of the river and sighed. His clothes were completely soaked again. He'd forgotten how much it sucked getting wet when you only had a few pairs of clothes, and what was worse, the water seemed to intensify the stench that still clung to them from the day before. On top of all that, his ass hurt like nothing else. Kakashi had long, bony fingers, and even though they, thankfully, hadn't ripped through his pants and actually impaled his butt, those hard fingers still left him feeling really sore. Naruto once again tried to think back to the first time he'd gone through this day and remember how things were supposed to go, but the memory was foggy after years of important, and tragic, memories being built up. He remembered passing, after seeming to fail, and he remembered why they passed, but the specifics were vague now. It had only been important that they'd passed, not what he'd said and how he'd acted during each and every event. He was certain that he'd gotten tied to the post for some reason, but the memory of what that reason was had been lost, or repressed, over the years. Fortunately for him, and for the hope of a better future, he was an expert at winging it. It didn't matter how he did it really, he just had to end up tied to the post, that was key. If he was tied to the post, then presumably everything else would work out the way it was supposed to. Kakashi would berate them for their stupidity, Sasuke and Sakura would give him some food, and then Kakashi would pass them. How hard could it be? With a strange feeling of impending doom, Naruto pulled his jacket off, twisted it to wring out the water, and then laid it out on the grass to dry as he sat down next to it. He rested his elbow on his knee and propped his chin up on his hand as he thought. He needed to do something to get himself in trouble, and while he could think of plenty of ideas for troublemaking, having spent so many years as a prankster, he couldn't think of anything that was sure to leave him tied to the post. Before he had a chance to figure it out, he heard Sakura's voice cry out in alarm from somewhere in the woods. In an instant he was on his feet and running towards the sound, leaving his jacket lying in the grass. Ooh, Sakura? Sakura spun on her heels at the sound of Sasuke's voice. Saku, Raw? It was coming from the other side of a large bush next to a tree. Sasuke-kun! She yelled happily as she hurried towards it. She pushed through the leaves and then stopped dead in her tracks. Sasuke was on his knees before her, one hand resting on the tree to hold himself up. His left leg was twisted backwards at the knee, his left arm was severed at the elbow, and dozens of shuriken and kunai were piercing his once perfect body. Blood poured from his stump of an arm, the weapon wounds, and from his mouth, staining his clothing red and pooling on the forest floor beneath him. "Sakura," he gasped, somehow speaking despite the kunai that had pierced his cheek, "help me." Sakura stared at his broken form, frozen, as tears welled up in her eyes. Despite his pleas for help, she knew that his injuries were fatal. Would it fall to her to tell him that? Would she have to hold him and watch his life drain out of him? She felt bile heave in her stomach and then did what came natural. She let out a loud piercing cry of terror and fainted. From a tree branch above her, Kakashi glanced up from his book and observed his handiwork. "I might have gone a little too far," he admitted to no one in particular. His one eye scanned the area around him and located the last member of his potential team. He leapt silently from his tree branch, prepared to end everything once and for all. "Ooh!" Sasuke heard the scream as he finished putting the final touches on his trap and rose to his feet. "That scream," he whispered, his brows knit, "that was Sakura." "Ninja fighting, lesson 2. Genjutsu," Kakashi said from just behind the Uchiha genius. Sakura fell for it easily. A disgusted smirk pulled at Sasuke's cheek as he shook his head. "Yeah, she'd fall for that, but I'm not the same as her." "Say that after you get a bell, Sasuke-kun," Kakashi replied with a condescending chuckle. Sasuke turned to face the Junin, his body relaxed, his eyes focused, and his arms hanging loosely at his sides. Kakashi casually pushed off of the tree and meandered towards the boy, still reading the book. "The strength of the most elite clan in the village, the Uchiha clan," he remarked, not bothering to look up from his book as he spoke. "I suppose this could be interesting, if you live up to all the hype that is." Sasuke stared at Kakashi for just a second longer and then attacked, his hands dipping into both the kunai holster on his right thigh and the one on his hip pouch. In the blink of an eye he'd sent 3 kunai spinning towards the lanky Junin. Kakashi's Icha paradise slipped back into his pouch as he easily jumped out of the way. Such an obvious attack is pointless, he chided with a hint of disappointment. Sasuke's smirk became more confident as one of the kunai vanished into a large bush, slicing through a rope that was holding back a branch. The branch sprang forward, launching its payload right at Kakashi. Kakashi's eyes widened in surprise at the trap as he once again leapt into the air to avoid it, barely managing to dodge the numerous knives that thudded into the trunk of a tree behind him. As he landed, he looked over his shoulder to see Sasuke already spinning towards him. This time there would be no dodging and Kakashi was forced to bring up his arm to block the kick aimed at his head. Kakashi brought up his free hand to grab the boy's leg and toss him, but Sasuke was already twisting in the air, his fist preparing to come down on the Junin's head. Kakashi's blocking arm shot up and caught Sasuke's fist, only to have the Uchiha continue twisting and bring his other leg up for a kick. Thinking quickly, Kakashi raised Sasuke up by his trapped hand and foot, using his forearms to block the kick. The move brought Sasuke's face just a few centimeters from his own and allowed him to see the boy's triumphant smile as the only free limb between the two of them. Sasuke's left hand shot towards the bells dangling from Kakashi's belt. "This kid is just a genin?" Kakashi marveled as Sasuke's full trap was finally revealed. To have thought so far ahead would be impressive in a chunin, in a genin fresh out of the academy it was incredible. Plus Sasuke's taijutsu was not that of a genin at all. Even still, he wasn't good enough yet. Kakashi pushed his arms forward and shifted his hips back, moving the young ninja away from him. Sasuke's fingertip grazed one of the bells, causing it to ring softly, but he wasn't close enough to get a hold of it. With the danger averted, Kakashi tossed Sasuke away from him. "I'm impressed," the Junin commented offhandedly. "I didn't even have time to read my book. I'll acknowledge that you are different from Sakura and you got much closer than Naruto." Even as he offered the compliment, there was something in his voice that said he wasn't really any more impressed with Sasuke than he was with Naruto or Sakura, and Sasuke didn't miss it. With a snarl, his fingers flew through several seals, ending on tiger as he took a deep breath and said, Kaden. Gukakyu no Jutsu. Kakashi gasped. There was no way a genin should have enough chakra to use that jutsu. The enormous fireball that erupted from Sasuke's mouth a second later, however, proved that at least one genin was fully capable of using it. As the flames died down, all that was left of the spot Kakashi had been standing was a smoking crater lined with hardened, black stone and burnt grass. He's gone, Sasuke realized as he began looking around frantically for his adversary. Where is he? To the side? No, above? Below you? Kakashi's voice answered his silent question as the ground beneath Sasuke shifted and a hand shot out of it. Doden. Shinju Zanshu no Jutsu. Sasuke managed one small cry of alarm before he was sucked into the ground up to his neck. Ninja fighting, lesson number 3. Ninjutsu, Kakashi said with a smile as he knelt next to the trapped genin. Well, you're already, heads, above the others in this area. He gave the boy's head a condescending little pat, mussed his dark hair, and then wandered off, fetching his book from his pouch as he walked away. You know, he added over his should just before he vanished from sight. They say an exposed nail should be hammered in. I'd be careful if I were you. Damn you, Sasuke grumbled, struggling to pull himself free. Ooh. Naruto fell into 2 bushes, tripped over an exposed tree root, and, while attempting to lean against a tree after one of those incidents, misjudged the length of his arm and slammed the side of his head into the tree before he finally found Sakura. He was more beat up after a short jog through the forest than he was after his beatings from both Kakashi and Sakura. He'd wanted to get to her quickly and was still trying to remember either what he had done to get himself tied to the tree the first time he'd lived through this day or come up with something that he could do that would end with the same results and had not been paying attention to his movements. Once again his mind proved that on the subconscious level, it couldn't remember that he was a short 12-year-old boy and not the tall man he'd eventually become. As he picked himself up from the ground for the 5th time and wiped his scratched hands against his pants to clear the blood, he found himself wishing that Sakura was her future self, if for no other reason than the fact that she could heal the scrapes and bruises that now covered his body quicker than even the Kyuubi's rejuvenating powers would. Sadly, she was not that person yet, but one day she would be, hopefully. For the time being, however, she was unconscious and seemed to be foaming at the mouth, her body twitching every couple of seconds. Naruto was pretty certain he hadn't seen this the first time around, as Sakura was decidedly unattractive at the moment and she'd just about always been the ideal by which he judged all other women. If he'd seen this side of her then, he might have rethought his measuring stick. Sakura-chan, he whispered, giving her a little shake. Sakura-chan, are you alright? Sakura mumbled something and then her eyes snapped open and she sat up, driving her forehead into Naruto's nose. Ow, she exclaimed. Damn it, Naruto. What the hell were you doing? Sasuke-kun. She began to look around frantically. Sasuke-kun, don't die and leave me behind. Where are you? Wa yo tallying ao? Naruto asked while massaging her nose. Sakura's oversized forehead packed quite the punch. Sakura grabbed him by the shoulders and, apparently forgetting that it was his nose she injured and not his ears, yelled, Have you seen Sasuke-kun? He was right over there, he was. A shudder ran through her body at the memory and she turned and once again called out, Sasuke-kun. Naruto looked from her wild eyes to the spot she'd pointed to and then back to her face once again. He wasn't sure what she was going on about, but Kakashi was most likely involved. Sakura-chan, Sasuke will be fine wherever he is. Kakashi, sensei is just testing us, he won't hurt us. No, Sakura yelled, working herself into hysterics. He was, oh god. Sasuke-kun is going to die unless we. This time it was Naruto's turn to grab her by the shoulders and shake her. He's fine, Sakura-chan, believe me. She didn't bother to answer as she continued to turn her head and look around frantically. Sakura-chan? Naruto started, realizing that with them alone he could apologize for his earlier words without making too much of a big deal about it, about what I said yesterday, and this morning, well, Sakura wasn't listening. Instead she pushed him roughly aside, sending him tumbling headlong into a thorny bush, and then ran off into the woods as she called out for Sasuke again. Naruto gingerly pulled himself from the bush and started to go after her, But in his haste he forgot to be conscious of his changed height and once again found himself face first on the ground. "This sucks," he grumbled as he sat up and ran his fingers through his too short hair. Ooh. It only took Sakura a moment of running headlong through the forest to find Sasuke, still stuck up to his neck in the ground. The two stared at each other for a moment, and then Sakura let out an ear-piercing scream as she cried, his severed head. All Sasuke could do was roll his eyes as she collapsed to the ground in a dead faint, and then went back to wiggling free of his dirt prison. 2 or 3 minutes later he'd created enough space to pull out one of his arms, and after that it was only another minute before his whole body was once again above ground, dirty and covered in scratches, but otherwise just fine. As he brushed the dirt from his clothes he eyed Sakura's prone form. With a sigh, he decided he couldn't just leave her laying there and walked over and gave her a small nudge. "Hey, wake up." Sakura's green eyes fluttered open a second later. "Sasuke-kun?" she asked in a dazed voice as her eyes slowly focused on him. "Sasuke-kun." In an instant she was up and her arms were tightly wrapped around his neck as her face buried itself in his chest. "You're alright?" she cried as her body shook with emotion. Sasuke's shock was enough to hold him in place for a moment before he began quickly trying to push her away. "What are you doing? Stop it, don't hug me." It took some time, but eventually she released him and stepped back, clearly embarrassed by her outburst and the spontaneous hug. "Sorry," she whispered as she blushed and looked down at the ground, her fingers nervously pulling at a small twig that had become tangled in her hair during one of her fainting sessions. "Whatever." Sasuke sighed dismissively. He glanced up at the sky and scowled at the sun hanging almost directly above them. "It's almost noon," he noted as he started to walk away. "I'm going." "You're still going to try to get the bell?" Sakura asked in bewilderment. "I already touched it. Next time I'll get it." Sakura's already immense awe at the Uchiha's abilities went up a couple of notches. "Wow, you're incredible, Sasuke-kun." And then somewhere in her mind a voice reminded her that if she didn't get one of those bells, and she was sure there was no way she would, and Sasuke did, she would be sent back to the academy while he would become a full-fledged ninja. "You know," she said in an offhand voice, "there isn't all that much time left. We, don't really have to push ourselves too hard. I mean, there's always, next time, right?" Sasuke's eyes narrowed and his gaze filled with loathing before he turned and walked away from her. For the second time in as many days, Sakura wished the ground would open up and swallow her. It seemed that every conversation she'd ever had with him, which admittedly was only those she'd had with him yesterday and today, ended with him finding her annoying. After taking a few steps, Sasuke stopped and looked down. "There's a man I have to kill," he said quietly. Sakura wasn't sure what he meant, but her heart leapt just from the fact that he was still willing to talk to her. "Do you mean Kakashi-sensei?" If Sasuke heard her, he didn't show it. "That time, he left me crying." "Crying? His voice trailed off again and this time he didn't seem to want to say anything more. "What do you mean, Sasuke-kun?" Sakura asked cautiously. For that one brief moment, even though she couldn't see his face, Sasuke actually looked vulnerable. It was something she'd never seen before and she couldn't help but wonder if anyone else had either. "I'm an Avenger," he replied, turning back towards her, his eyes suddenly burning with emotions that had risen to the surface. "I have to become stronger than that man. I can't just stay around here and—" Whatever he was going to say was cut off by the sound of a bell ringing in the distance. "Damn!" the dark-haired boy swore as he looked towards the sound. "I wasted too much time with you." Without another word, he turned and walked towards the spot where the 3 posts and Kakashi were waiting for them, leaving Sakura to stare after him in confusion. 10 minutes later, Naruto and Sasuke were sitting on the ground between the posts. Sakura was tied to the middle post, and Kakashi was standing in front of them. Just behind him there was a circle of bricks that had been set in the ground surrounding the stone monument they had seen earlier. "You guys look hungry," the Junin remarked casually, his one eye lazily shifting from face to face. "Why'd Sakura-chan get tied up?" Naruto asked, leaving his next question, "Why her and not me?" to himself. "Well, I suppose technically all of you should be tied to these posts, since none of you managed to get a bell, but 2 of you at least tried and weren't completely inept. Plus, I'm feeling generous today, so I'm rewarding your efforts. Sakura-chan, on the other hand, barely even saw me, so she doesn't get a reward." Sakura's face burned with humiliation and she wanted to cry. It was bad enough that Sasuke had to see her fail like this, but to be outdone by Naruto too. It was almost too much shame for her to handle. Her nightmares from the previous night suddenly looked less like bad dreams and more like premonitions. Now then, about the training, Kakashi continued. Oblivious to her discomfort, there's clearly no need for you three to go back to the academy. The Junin eyed each of his potential pupils, watching them go through the usual emotions. Sasuke scowled, but seemed to have expected as much, no doubt aware of just how good he was. Sakura was surprised and delighted, which wasn't surprising since she didn't do anything. And Naruto? Naruto just sat there, looking neither surprised nor pleased. It was almost as if he was waiting for the hammer to fall. Kakashi shook this idea away just as quickly as he had the thought that the blonde had known about the reason for the no eating suggestion. Naruto would have no way of knowing how this test was supposed to go, nor could he have possibly guessed what was coming next. He was probably just tired and hungry and more interested in food, or the cute girl tied to the post next to him, than in what his instructor was telling him. That was, after all, the way the academy instructors had described him. So then, Sakura said excitedly, all three of us. Kakashi smiled through his mask. Yup, all three of you should quit as ninja. Sasuke's eyes narrowed dangerously, and Kakashi wouldn't have been surprised if the boy jumped to his feet and attacked him. Sakura's mouth hung open and her eyes were wide with alarm. And Naruto? Naruto sighed and picked at some grass, looking very confused, but not terribly alarmed. For a long moment, no one said anything, and Kakashi wondered if they were going to be so pathetically complacent as to give up their dreams just because their leader told them to. Finally, Naruto, who still was showing the least reaction to the news, looked up from the grass his fingers were still tugging at and asked, why? Sakura seemed to awaken at Naruto's words and added, yeah. We couldn't get the bells, but why should we have to quit because of that? Kakashi looked down his nose at them and sneered, though it was probably hard to read his expression completely through his mask. Because all of you are just punks who don't deserve to be ninja, he replied matter-of-factly. Sasuke's jaw flexed and the killer intent rolling off of him nearly doubled. Kakashi let his eye fall on the dark-haired boy and raised a questioning eyebrow. That was all that was needed for Sasuke to spring to his feet and charge at the Junin. Sasuke-kun, Sakura cried out, struggling against the rope that bound her. The words were scarcely out of her mouth before it was all over. Sasuke's arm was pinned behind his back by an iron-tight grip and his face was driven into the ground by Kakashi's foot while the Junin calmly sat on him. This is why you're a punk, Kakashi informed the futilely struggling boy, shifting his foot so that it pressed a little more painfully down on his captive. Don't step on Sasuke-kun, Sakura yelled as she struggled against her bindings. Kakashi glanced up at her and then turned towards Naruto, who seemed to finally be paying attention. Action was obviously more interesting to him than words. It was too bad he seemed so disinterested in what Kakashi was telling them. Unless he and his teammates looked beneath what was being said, chances were they would fail. Naruto seemed to have good instincts, given the apparently lack of training he'd received, if his kunai aim was anything to go on, but if all he was going to put those good instincts towards was following orders blindly, he was simply a waste of decent potential. Are you guys underestimating what it means to be a ninja? Kakashi asked at last. Why do you think you were divided into teams? Why do you think we're doing this training? Huh? What do you mean? Sakura asked in confusion while Naruto stared at her. Kakashi shook his head resignedly. You three still don't understand the answer to this test. So, are you going to tell us the answer? Sakura asked hopefully. Geez, Kakashi groaned, are you all really this dumb? Just tell us the answer already, sensei, Naruto sighed, sounding equally annoyed. It's teamwork. Sakura and Sasuke's heads snapped up at the announcement, while Naruto looked slightly nervous, but not as surprised as he should have been. Once again, Kakashi considered the possibility that the blonde might have already guessed the answer, but then dismissed it. He realized that he'd been doing that far too often for comfort lately, but, again, if Naruto had figured it out, he would have done something about it. Besides, acting as a team wasn't really enough, nor was it the complete answer to the test. The three of you working together might have been able to get the bells from me, but on your own you stood no chance, he explained. What do you mean by teamwork? Sakura yelled in frustration. There were only 2 bells. Even if we worked together and managed to get both of them, one of us would still have failed. What kind of teamwork is that? This just makes us fight each other. Kakashi waited for a moment to see if she would work her way to the next logical step, but she seemed to run out of steam, so he said, "Of course this test was designed to make you fight amongst yourselves." At her confused expression and Naruto's apparent lack of understanding and/or caring, Kakashi added, "The whole purpose was to see if you could forget about your own interests and work together under controlled circumstances. We wouldn't want to find out you were only going to look out for yourselves while on a real mission, after all." He looked off to the side and rubbed his one visible eye with his thumb. "Sakura, instead of Naruto, who was right next to you, you were only thinking of Sasuke, who was far away." He turned towards the blonde who had gone back to pulling at the grass. "Naruto, you spent half your time running around by yourself or looking for Sakura." He pushed his foot a little harder down on Sasuke's head to make sure he had his full attention and said, "Sasuke, you just assumed the others would get in your way and tried to do everything yourself. Ninja duties are preformed by the team. Of course, superior individual abilities are important, but what's even more important is teamwork. If you're acting on your own out there, your teammates are at risk and you could even get yourself killed. For instance," he reached into his hip pouch, pulled out a kunai, and wrenched Sasuke's arm to the side as he leaned over him threateningly. "Sakura. Decide right now. Do I kill Sasuke or Naruto?" Sakura gaped at him while Naruto watched her curiously. His lack of reaction was beginning to bother Kakashi. The boy simply wasn't who all of the reports, as well as Hokage-sama's personal opinion, had led him to believe that he was. Naruto was quiet to the point of passivity. He just watched everything happening around him, sometimes with an almost detached disinterest. It was unnerving. "I can't decide something like that," Sakura yelled in distress, bringing Kakashi back to the here and now. Kakashi pulled the kunai away from Sasuke's neck and stood up. "The day might come, when one or even all of you are taken hostage, and you're forced to make that sort of a decision. When you're on a mission, your lives will always be on the line." He walked a few paces to the east and looked down at the large cut stone with several marble markers that looked like tombstones around it. The simple, elegant memorial seemed out of place in the wooded area of a training ground, but that was the reason it was there. So that those who used the training ground would never forget why they trained and who had come before them. "Look at this marker," he said in a quiet voice, his eye automatically going to a specific name carved upon it. All of the names carved into this stone belonged to heroes of this village. His friend's carefree smiling face flashed before his mind, followed quickly by the blood-covered version that was the last memory he had of Obito. But the ones listed here aren't just any heroes. They're the names of those who have died in the line of duty. Naruto stared intently at the stone. It wasn't half as filled as the last time he'd visited it, when he carved Konohamaru's name into it himself. The blank spaces on that stone represented the hope he had for the future. If he had it his way, few, if any, names would be added to it during this lifetime. His precious people would be protected above all else, no matter what. He wasn't going to see another name get carved on that blasted stone ever again. "This is a memorial," Kakashi explained. "The names of my best friends are carved on it, along with the names of people's mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters. Whole families have been carved into this stone and more will be added to it in the future." He bowed his head for a moment and then looked over his shoulder at his subdued students. "I'm going to give you one last chance," he said coldly, as if their failure to work together was an insult to the names on the stone, and, truthfully, he thought it was. "This one will be far more difficult than our little game with the bells. If you're prepared to continue, you may eat one of the bento boxes." His eye bore into them as he added, "But no sharing with Sakura-chan. Of the three of you, she did the least. Naruto and Sasuke at least came close to getting a bell, but all she did was pass out. If either of you feed her, you failed the test right there, and I will make sure that any other Junin you ever manage to convince to give you a shot at being on a team will know that you don't follow direct orders. On this training field, my word is law. Do you understand?" Sasuke gave a small nod, but Naruto continued staring at the stone, transfixed. Kakashi waited for a few more seconds and then vanished in a puff of smoke, leaving the three by themselves. "It's okay guys, I don't need lunch anyway," Sakura lied as her stomach grumbled in protest. Naruto reached out, took one of the boxes and slipped his chopsticks out of their sleeve, but did not start eating. His eyes darted from the food to Sasuke and then up to Sakura. Sasuke thoughtfully placed a piece of takoyaki in his mouth and glanced up at Sakura, who was doing her best to keep quiet and not call any attention to herself, despite the fact that both boys kept looking at her. After another growl from her stomach, Naruto looked pleadingly at Sasuke. He still hadn't touched his food, and wanted desperately to share it with his future friend, but Sasuke was the one who had initiated the sharing the first time. That much, at least, he remembered, and Naruto didn't want to change anything that had worked out properly the first time around. Again Sasuke glanced up at her. Aside from the takoyaki, he still hadn't touched much of his lunch either, but once again he looked away. Naruto watched him for a moment and then shook his head in frustration. Why was Sasuke acting like it would be harder to offer food to Sakura when he'd done it fairly easily for him the first time? She was a girl, for crying out loud. It was natural to want to help them. He waited just a little longer and then gave it up for lost. He reached into the kunai holster on his right thigh, pulled one of the knives out, and cut the rope binding her, careful to remember that his arms were shorter than his brain wanted to think they were. "What are you doing, Naruto?" she demanded as her bindings fell away. "You're going to get us in trouble. Do you want to split my lunch with me or not?" Naruto asked with a roll of his eyes. Sensei is probably a long ways off and you won't be much help to us if you're so hungry you can't stand, right, Sasuke? Sasuke nodded quickly and passed his lunch to her as well. "There are some umeboshi in here, you can have them if you like." Sakura's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the Uchiha. "Umeboshi are my favorite," she whispered. He merely shrugged, picked out another takoyaki, and ate it without looking at her or Naruto. The three ate together for several minutes, enjoying the food after having gone so long without. There wasn't much in the way of conversation, but the atmosphere was relaxed. Naruto continued to stare at the monument thoughtfully. Sakura continued to stare at Sasuke happily, and Sasuke did his best to look anywhere but at his teammates. Suddenly, the ground in front of them erupted with an enormous explosion. Sasuke immediately leapt to his feet, his hand reaching for a kunai as he positioned himself slightly in front of Sakura. Naruto also was on his feet, but had reacted much slower and was less prepared to defend himself than Sasuke. "You!" Kakashi's voice boomed out of the clearing smoke as his head appeared in front of them, his face a mask of rage. Then suddenly he smiled and his face relaxed. "Pass," he finished in a happy, nearly ecstatic, voice as he winked at them. "We pass?" Sakura asked in astonishment, her heart still beating hard in her chest from the Junin's sudden, and rather frightening, appearance. "But why? Not only do you pass," Kakashi replied, practically beaming, "but you're the first to pass. Everyone else just ran around doing every stupid I said, no matter how dumb the orders. They were all morons." He glanced down at the mostly eaten meals and sighed contentedly. A ninja has to be able to see underneath the underneath. Those who don't follow the rules or don't obey orders in the ninja world are called trash, but those who do not care for or support their comrades, even if that means violating orders once in a while, are lower than trash. Kakashi watched the information sink into all of his students, his first students, and smiled. Even Naruto was reacting the way he expected him to, whooping it up with Sakura, while Sasuke looked on with a reserved grin on his face. "That officially ends the training," Kakashi said after watching their celebration for a moment. "All of you pass. So starting tomorrow we'll begin our duties as Team 7. Come on, we'll head back to the village and I'll show you where we're supposed to meet in the mornings." The four headed towards the Hokage Tower, three very happy that they had managed to pass their final exam and one slightly disappointed that one of his students had cut the rope so he couldn't leave anyone tied to the post for a while as his best friend had once been, long ago. Even with that minor disappointment, it was a happy day for Hitaki Kakashi. He had a genin team to lead, three students who had passed the test where the all previous teams he'd tested had failed miserably. On top of that, one already showed excellent potential, another wasn't as bad as advertised and was proving to at least be interesting, and the third was incredibly intelligent according to the reports her academy teachers had written. Yes, this was a team he could expect big things out of.
That's all for now. If you enjoy this video, then please like, share and do comments.